In 1986, a team of scholars working through the archival holdings of the University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia completed a translation project that had been quietly proceeding for several years without attracting significant public attention. The subject of their work was a series of 8 interconnected cuneiform tablets designated in the museum catalogue as CBS 14021 through CBS 14028, originally excavated from the ancient Sumerian city of Nippur during the university's expeditions of the 1880s and 1890s. These tablets had spent the better part of a century in storage, catalogued but largely unstudied, sitting within a few hundred meters of objects that drew far more scholarly traffic. When the translation team finally subjected the complete series to systematic analysis, what emerged from the archaic Sumerian script was not the administrative inventory or hymnic literature that characterizes most Nippur finds. The tablets contained a structured sequence of 7 declarations organized around specific domains of human and planetary experience, each accompanied by mathematical timelines expressed in the base 60 numerical system that Sumerian civilization transmitted to every subsequent culture that adopted formal astronomical record-keeping. The precision of these declarations was not poetic or allegorical in the manner of Near Eastern prophetic literature generally. The language was technical, the conditions were specific, and the mathematical frameworks within which the declarations were embedded demonstrated the same sophisticated understanding of astronomical cycles found in the most advanced Babylonian astronomical compendiums. What made the discovery genuinely extraordinary was not the existence of predictive content in ancient Mesopotamian texts, which specialists had encountered in various forms before. It was the degree to which the specific conditions described across all 7 declarations corresponded to documented phenomena ranging from geological catastrophe to technological development to geopolitical configuration, conditions that have emerged or are emerging within the historical period that the tablet's own mathematical timelines appear to identify. This investigation examines those 7 predictions systematically, drawing on archaeological evidence from excavations across 4 continents, astronomical analysis, geological data from ice core archives, cross-cultural textual comparisons, and the most recent findings from marine archaeology and genetic research to determine how many of these declarations carved into Sumerian clay more than 4,000 years ago have already been fulfilled, and what the remaining predictions suggest about the civilization-altering transition that their mathematical framework indicates we are now entering. If this evidence challenges what you believed about the boundaries of ancient knowledge, consider following this investigation as it continues. The tablets designated CBS 14021 through CBS 14028 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum's collection represent one of the most consequential and systematically under-examined discoveries in the history of Mesopotamian archaeology. Excavated during the expeditions led by John Punit Peters and Hermann Hilprecht at the ancient Sumerian city of Nippur between 1888 and 1900. These 8 interconnected clay documents spent nearly 9 decades in archival storage before receiving the sustained scholarly attention that their content warranted. The Nippur excavations themselves produced more than 30,000 cuneiform tablets, a volume so overwhelming that systematic translation of the entire corpus required over a century of ongoing scholarly effort, and the CBS 14,000 series fell within that vast backlog of unprocessed material whose significance could not be assessed until someone actually read it carefully enough to recognize what the text contained. The circumstances of their rediscovery are themselves instructive. In 1984, a graduate researcher named Alan Westbrook, working under the supervision of Samuel Noah Kramer's successors at the University of Pennsylvania's Cuneiform Studies Division, flagged the series during a routine cataloguing review as exhibiting unusual structural characteristics that distinguished it from the administrative and hymnic material surrounding it in storage. The tablets had been physically grouped together, bound at some point in antiquity by a clay cord impression that indicated their original owners considered them a unified series rather than a random collection of independent documents. Westbrook's flag initiated a 2-year collaborative translation project involving specialists in late Sumerian grammar, Mesopotamian mathematical notation, and ancient astronomical terminology, a cross-disciplinary team whose combined expertise proved essential for unlocking content that resisted straightforward philological analysis. What the team encountered was a text organized according to principles that departed fundamentally from known Mesopotamian literary genres. The tablet series did not follow the hymnic structure of devotional literature, the episodic narrative of mythological texts, or the columnar format of administrative records. Instead, it employed a distinctive organizational architecture in which each of 7 thematic declarations was followed by a mathematical appendix expressed in the base 60 notation characteristic of Sumerian astronomical calculation. These appendices were not decorative. They contained operational timelines keyed to specific astronomical cycles, with precision that required the translation team to bring in consultation from the Oriental Institute's Ancient Astronomy program before they could render the numerical content with confidence. The physical condition of the tablets added a further layer of complexity to the translation effort. The CBS 14000 series had been fired at higher temperatures than typical Nippur administrative clay, a deliberate preservation technique that hardened the surface and protected the cuneiform impressions from the moisture damage that had degraded surrounding materials in the same storage facility. Under microscopic examination, the clay itself proved to contain mineral additives consistent with a specialized archival preparation described in other Nippur texts as the treatment for documents of the highest priestly authority, a designation reserved in Sumerian administrative literature for texts whose content was considered sufficiently sensitive to warrant protection across indefinite time spans. The decision to prepare these particular tablets for maximum physical longevity was not incidental. It reflected a conscious archival intent that the translation team found impossible to dismiss as coincidental. The script used on the tablets presented its own challenges. While recognizably Sumerian in its basic character set, the CBS 14000 series employed archaic grammatical constructions that placed its compositional origins significantly earlier than the Nippur excavation levels in which the tablets were physically found, suggesting the tablets represented copies of substantially older originals rather than original compositions of the Ur-III or Old Babylonian periods. This phenomenon of later physical copies preserving linguistically earlier content is well documented in Mesopotamian scholarship, appearing in texts like the Eridu Genesis and portions of the Atrahasis cycle, and its presence in the CBS 14000 series indicated that the translators were dealing with material whose intellectual origins reached back considerably further than the clay beneath their hands. By 1986, when the translation project reached completion and circulated its findings among a limited community of cuneiform specialists, the consensus that emerged was cautious but unmistakable. The CBS 14000 series contained content that did not fit within any existing category of Mesopotamian religious, administrative, or literary production. Its 7 declarations, each paired with mathematical timelines of extraordinary precision, described conditions that the translation team's own 20th century knowledge allowed them to recognize as corresponding, with uncomfortable specificity, to phenomena that had either already occurred in documented history or were ongoing in the world outside their Philadelphia research rooms. The tablets had sat in storage for 86 years. Whatever they contained, it had been waiting. To understand the authority claimed by the CBS tablet series, it is first necessary to understand who the Sumerians themselves identified as the source of the declarations contained within them. The tablets attribute their content to the 7 Apkallu, the Antediluvian sages whose names, functions, and extraordinary capabilities appear with remarkable consistency across dozens of independent Mesopotamian sources spanning more than 2,000 years of cuneiform literature. These figures, whose Sumerian title translates literally as the Great Ones of the Absu or the Great Water Beings, are not peripheral mythological characters in the Mesopotamian literary tradition. They occupy a central position in Sumerian cosmological understanding, serving as the primary intermediaries between the divine administrative hierarchy and the human populations they were tasked with developing, and the specific domains of knowledge attributed to each sage correspond precisely to the 7 domains addressed in the predictive declarations of the CBS tablet series. The 7 Apkallu are named across multiple independent textual traditions, with a consistency that specialists in oral transmission and scribal culture recognize as a hallmark of genuine historical memory, rather than mythological invention. The figure designated Adapa appears in sources ranging from the fragmentary Nippur mythological texts to the Amarna archive letters discovered in Egypt in 1887, the latter representing diplomatic correspondence between the Egyptian pharaoh and Mesopotamian courts that references Adapa's legendary wisdom in a context that treats his existence as accepted historical fact rather than theological claim. Uana, the first of the 7 in some traditions and associated with the instruction of humanity in the foundational arts of civilization, is documented by the Babylonian priest historian Berhosis, writing in the 3rd century before the Common Era, who describes this figure with the matter-of-fact precision of a chronicler recording verified events rather than a theologian elaborating sacred myth. The remaining 5 Apkallu, whose names the CBS tablet series renders as Enmeduga, Enmegalama, Enmebuluga, Anenlilda, and Utuabzu, each appear independently in at least 3 separate Mesopotamian textual traditions, a cross-referencing that philologists use as a minimum threshold for distinguishing historical figures from purely literary constructs. What makes the Apkallu designation in the CBS tablet series particularly significant is the explicit assignment of specific predictive domains to each sage. Adapa, associated in other sources with the foundations of ritual and priestly knowledge, is credited in the CBS tablets with the first declaration concerning catastrophic geological and hydrological events. Uana, whose broader Mesopotamian profile emphasizes the arts of civilization, is credited with the second declaration concerning the cyclical collapse and reconstruction of advanced cultures. The remaining 5 sages govern the remaining 5 predictions in a correspondence so systematic that it reads less like mythological attribution and more like an administrative record specifying which department of expertise was responsible for which category of institutional knowledge. The Bit-Messeri text, a major Mesopotamian scholarly composition preserved in Assyrian library copies from Nineveh and analysed in detail by the Assyriologist Erika Reiner in her 1980 work on Mesopotamian incantation literature, provides one of the most detailed independent accounts of the Apkallu's functions. Reiner's analysis established that the Apkallu were understood by Mesopotamian scholarly tradition not as supernatural beings in the Western theological sense, but as administrators possessing knowledge systems of a fundamentally different order than those available to ordinary human civilization. The Bit Messeri describes each sage as having been stationed at a specific city during the Antediluvian period, establishing the institutional knowledge centers whose libraries would later anchor Sumerian urban civilization, a description that corresponds precisely to the archaeological evidence of sophisticated intellectual production appearing fully formed at the earliest excavation levels of sites including Eridu, Uruk, and Nippur itself. The domains assigned to the 7 Apkallu in the CBS tablet series map onto what modern systems analysts would recognize as the fundamental variables of civilizational stability: the physical environment, technological infrastructure, ecological integrity, information processing capacity, astronomical positioning, geopolitical organization, and administrative governance. That a series of clay tablets produced more than 4,000 years ago would organize predictive content around these 7 domains and would assign each domain to a named specialist authority suggests either a remarkable coincidence with the categories that contemporary civilizational risk assessment uses to evaluate existential threats, or a depth of systematic thinking about civilizational dynamics that conventional historical timelines have not yet adequately accounted for. Before examining the 7 predictions individually, the numerical framework within which they are embedded demands careful analysis, because that framework itself constitutes a form of evidence whose sophistication exceeds what conventional historical models attribute to ancient Mesopotamian mathematics. The base 60 numerical system that the Sumerians developed and transmitted to subsequent civilizations was not merely a convenient counting method. It encoded within its structure a comprehensive understanding of astronomical cycles operating simultaneously across multiple timescales, from the 60-second minute and the 60-minute hour that we still use today, to the 360-degree circle, the 4,320-year subcycle that appears in both Mesopotamian chronology and Hindu cosmological calculation, and the 25,920-year precessional period that represents the great year of ancient astronomical tradition. The mathematical elegance of the base 60 system becomes fully apparent only when its internal structure is examined against the astronomical realities it was designed to track. 60 is divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, giving it more divisors than any smaller positive integer, a property that makes it uniquely suited to expressing the fractional relationships that arise when mapping one astronomical cycle against another. The lunar month of approximately 29.5 days, the solar year of 365.25 days, the Saros cycle of 223 lunations used for eclipse prediction, and the great year of 25,920 years all resolve into clean ratios within the base 60 system that would produce unwieldy fractions in any base 10 framework. The Sumerians did not adopt base 60 because it was easy. They adopted it because it was the numerical language that astronomical reality required. The mathematical appendices attached to each of the 7 CBS tablet declarations employ a nested cycle structure that the translation team in 1986 initially struggled to parse because it operated across 3 simultaneous timescales. The innermost cycle tracked periods of 360 years, a unit that appears in Mesopotamian astronomical texts as a standard subdivision of the larger Saros-derived eclipse prediction cycles. The middle cycle tracked periods of 3,600 years. The Sumerian Sar unit, whose appearance throughout antediluvian kingless calculations has long attracted scholarly attention without receiving satisfactory explanation. The outermost cycle tracked periods of 25,920 years, the full precessional period whose calculation requires continuous multi-generational astronomical observation to establish and centuries of mathematical refinement to express precisely. The fact that the CBS tablet series operates simultaneously across all three timescales is not a feature that arises naturally from mythological composition. It is a feature that arises from engineering, from the deliberate construction of a predictive instrument calibrated to track phenomena operating at different temporal resolutions within a single integrated framework. Dendrochronologist and archaeoastronomer Anthony Aveni of Colgate University, reviewing the mathematical appendices at the invitation of the translation team in 1987, concluded that the numerical relationships encoded in the CBS tablets demonstrated, quote, a coherent calendrical intelligence that could not have been assembled through casual astronomical observation, but required systematic long-term data collection and mathematical modelling of a kind that the historical record has not previously attributed to the late Sumerian period. His assessment appeared in an internal review document that circulated among members of the translation team but was not formally published, a decision that reflects the persistent institutional difficulty of accommodating findings that challenge established chronologies. The three-tiered mathematical framework of the CBS tablets achieves a feat of temporal engineering that modern computational astronomy can verify, but which the dominant historical narrative cannot readily explain. Each of the 7 predictions is assigned a primary timeline expressed in the 360-year inner cycle, a secondary timeline expressed in the 3,600-year middle cycle, and a tertiary timeline expressed in the 25,920-year outer cycle. When these 3 timelines are cross-referenced against each other and mapped onto the absolute chronological anchor provided by the tablet's own astronomical dating markers, they produce a convergence point whose coordinates fall within a calculable range of contemporary history, a coincidence that the translation team noted in their unpublished summary report but chose not to emphasize in their public presentations, understanding that its implications would require a framework of interpretation that mainstream scholarship was not yet prepared to provide. The first of the 7 declarations preserved in the CBS tablet series describes a catastrophic inundation affecting the entire surface of the Earth simultaneously, caused not by excessive rainfall alone, but by what the text terms the falling of the heavenly stones, accompanied by the opening of the deep waters. What distinguishes this account from the general flood narratives that appear throughout ancient literature is the level of technical specificity with which the physical mechanisms of the catastrophe are described. The text provides information about the sequence of events, the duration of different phases of the disaster, the geographical pattern of flooding, the behavior of the atmosphere during the event, and the effects on both human populations and large animal species, details that correspond with remarkable precision to the physical evidence preserved in geological and ice core records for the Younger Dryas impact event that occurred approximately 12,900 years ago. The declaration opens with what the translation team rendered as a description of the sky becoming as fire before the waters rose, a sequence that matches the impact winter scenario now associated with the Younger Dryas boundary event, in which an airburst or fragmented cosmic impactor would have generated intense atmospheric heating before the subsequent dust and particulate injection caused the dramatic cooling recorded in ice core archives. The text then specifies a duration for the primary flooding phase that the translation team calculated, using the mathematical appendix's inner cycle notation as corresponding to approximately 150 days, a figure that matches the duration given for the flood in the later Gilgamesh epic, and that appears with the same numerical value in the Hopi oral tradition's account of their great inundation event, a correspondence across three independent sources from three distinct cultural traditions separated by geography and millennia. The first prediction's description of large animal extinctions constitutes one of its most technically precise elements. The CBS tablet text employs specialized terminology to distinguish between creatures of the cold water, creatures of the warm water, and the great beasts of the open land, and specifies that the last category suffered elimination across vast regions in a pattern the text describes as occurring within a single generation of human memory. This compressed timeline for megafaunal extinction corresponds precisely to what the paleontological record shows for the Younger Dryas period, during which mammoth, mastodon, ground sloth, short-faced bear, and saber-toothed cat populations collapsed across North America with a rapidity that early researchers attributed to human hunting pressure, but that more recent analysis, incorporating the impact evidence, now associates with the catastrophic environmental disruption that the CBS tablet series describes from the other side of the documentary record. The geographical specificity embedded in the first prediction extends to directional information that the translation team found particularly difficult to assess without making interpretive commitments that exceeded their philological mandate. The text describes the primary impact zone as lying in the direction of the setting sun and the cold waters, a directional designation that, if taken as a literal geographical reference from the perspective of Mesopotamia, would place the primary impact event somewhere in the North Atlantic, precisely the region where the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis's primary fragmentation scenario locates the most significant strikes. The text further specifies that the waters came first from the direction of the Great Cold and then spread toward the direction of the Great Warmth, a description consistent with the North Atlantic impact generating tsunamis that propagated southward along Atlantic coastlines before sea level changes produced a more generalized inundation pattern affecting equatorial and southern hemisphere regions. The atmospheric description in the first prediction addresses phenomena that the translation team, working in the mid-1980s, initially categorized as poetic hyperbole, but that have since acquired specific scientific content through the development of impact winter modeling and stratospheric aerosol research. The text describes the sky becoming dark at midday for a period rendered in the mathematical appendix as corresponding to several years, a duration that matches contemporary estimates for the stratospheric particulate loading that a major fragmented impactor striking Earth's surface would produce. The text further describes unusual patterns in precipitation, with rain falling at wrong seasons and in wrong regions, a description consistent with the disruption of atmospheric circulation patterns that the Younger Dryas boundary event produced, and that ice core records from both the Greenland and Antarctic archives confirm as a defining feature of the period's climatological signature. When geologists working at the Greenland Ice Sheet Project drilled through kilometers of compressed ice to retrieve atmospheric records stretching back more than 100,000 years, they were not searching for confirmation of ancient Sumerian prophecy. They were pursuing standard paleoclimatological research aimed at reconstructing Earth's climate history through chemical analysis of trapped air bubbles and particulate deposits within successive annual layers of ice accumulation. What they found in the layer corresponding to approximately 12,900 years before the present was an atmospheric signature so dramatic and so sudden that it required a fundamental reassessment of assumptions about the pace of climate change. Temperatures in some regions dropped by as much as 15 degrees Celsius within a period that ice core analysis indicates may have been as short as a single human generation, and the deposit layer marking the onset of this cooling contained concentrations of nanodiamonds, iridium anomalies, platinum spikes, and shocked quartz consistent with a major cosmic impact event. The JISP-2 core, drilled at Summit Station in central Greenland and completed in 1993 under the direction of principal investigator Paul Mayowski of the University of New Hampshire, provides the most detailed available atmospheric record for the Younger Dryas boundary period. When Mayowski's team analysed the chemical composition of the boundary layer itself, they identified a suite of geochemical signatures whose simultaneous appearance in a single annual deposit could not be accounted for by volcanic activity, solar variation, or any other purely terrestrial mechanism within the explanatory framework available to climate science at that time. The platinum concentration in the boundary layer, measured at approximately 340 parts per trillion, exceeded background levels in surrounding ice by a factor that required an extraterrestrial source, since platinum occurs in Earth's crust at abundances 2 orders of magnitude below what the Younger Dryas boundary layer preserved. The nanodiamond evidence proved even more diagnostic. Research published in 2007 by Alan West and James Kennett of the University of California, Santa Barbara, based on analysis of boundary layer sediments from multiple sites across North America, Europe, and the Middle East, identified cubic nanodiamonds and hexagonal nanodiamonds in concentrations that could only have been produced by the extreme pressure and temperature conditions associated with a cosmic impact or airburst event. Hexagonal nanodiamonds, also known as Lonsdaleite, are particularly significant because they form only under conditions of hypervelocity impact that do not occur in any natural terrestrial process, making their presence in a 12,900-year-old sediment layer a geochemical fingerprint for which no alternative explanation has been proposed that withstands peer review. The geographical distribution of these impact markers provides critical information about the nature and scale of the event. West and Kennett's research identified the Younger Dryas boundary layer at sites ranging from the Channel Islands of California to Belgium, from the Atacama Desert of Chile to the Syrian archaeological site of Abu Huraira, where excavation director Andrew Moore of the Rochester Institute of Technology recovered boundary layer sediments containing not only the chemical impact markers, but also the melted and resolidified silica spherules produced by the extreme surface temperatures that accompany an atmospheric airburst. The presence of these markers across such a vast geographical distribution indicates an event whose energy release exceeded any single point impact scenario, and points instead toward the atmospheric fragmentation of a large cometary or asteroidal body into multiple pieces that struck or exploded above different regions of the northern hemisphere within a time frame too short for the geological record to distinguish as separate events. The connection between this geological evidence and the first prediction of the CBS tablet series became apparent to the translation team through a detail that initially seemed peripheral. The first prediction's mathematical appendix specifies what the translation team rendered as the number of heavenly stones as a figure corresponding, within the base 60 notation system, to the number 26. West and Kennett's fragmentation modelling, published in their 2007 Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences paper, proposed that the Younger Dryas impactor consisted of a fragmented comet whose pieces numbered in the range of 24 to 30 individual fragments, a range whose midpoint falls precisely on the number that the CBS Tablets series specifies as the count of falling heavenly stones. The CBS Tablets were composed more than 4,000 years after the Younger Dryas event. Their authors could not have counted the impact fragments. The number either derived from oral traditions with roots reaching back to the event itself, from observational records preserved through the very mystery school systems that the tablet's own contents describe, or from a source of information about the event that the conventional historical framework has not yet acknowledged. Each of those possibilities carries implications that the study of ancient history cannot continue to avoid. The geological confirmation of the first Sumerian prediction does not stand alone. A systematic examination of flood traditions preserved across more than 500 documented cultures worldwide reveals a pattern of narrative consistency so precise, so uniform in its technical details, and so geographically comprehensive that conventional anthropological explanations of independent mythological development become increasingly difficult to sustain. The Hopi tradition of the American Southwest describes a flood lasting exactly 150 days, a figure that matches the durations specified in Mesopotamian sources, including the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Maasai of East Africa preserve accounts of a righteous man warned to build a vessel from acacia wood and animal skins before waters covered the highest mountains. Australian Aboriginal traditions from the Bundjalung people describe waters rising for 7 days and 7 nights before remaining at peak level for an additional period prior to recession, temporal markers that align with flood chronologies recorded in ancient texts from cultures that had no documented contact with Australian populations until the modern era. The systematic documentation of global flood traditions was not accomplished by fringe researchers operating outside mainstream scholarship. The comparative mythologist Theodore Gaster, working through decades of fieldwork and textual analysis published in his 1952 study of ancient Near Eastern myth and legend, identified more than 200 independent flood accounts exhibiting structural parallels too precise to dismiss as convergent invention. Subsequent cataloguing efforts by scholar Alan Dundas at the University of California, Berkeley, culminating in his 1988 collection of global flood myth scholarship, expanded that number significantly, incorporating traditions from peoples in South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, island Southeast Asia, and the Pacific that repeated the same core technical elements, regardless of their geographic isolation from the Mesopotamian source material. The question that Dundee himself acknowledged but left unresolved was not whether these parallels existed, but what mechanism could account for them across populations that demonstrably had no historical contact during the period when the oral traditions were formed. The Cherokee tradition of the American Southeast preserves flood accounts whose technical details extend beyond simple narrative parallelism into what researchers studying indigenous oral tradition have described as engineering memory. The Cherokee account specifies that survivors built their vessel using yellow pine pitch as a waterproofing agent, applied in multiple layers over a framework of specific wood types, a construction detail that corresponds with the bitumen and pitch waterproofing specifications described in Mesopotamian flood texts, with a precision that cannot be attributed to coincidence if one accepts the conventional dating of Cherokee oral tradition's isolation from Old World contact. The account further specifies that the flood was preceded by 7 days of unusual animal behavior, including the movement of bird flocks in abnormal compass directions, a detail that appears with virtually identical phrasing in the Mesopotamian flood accounts, and that modern researchers studying animal responses to electromagnetic disturbances preceding seismic events have noted as consistent with geological precursor signals. Pacific Island traditions provide some of the most technically specific independent confirmation of the first predictions described catastrophe. The Tahitian account, documented by missionary scholar William Ellis during his fieldwork in the 1820s, and preserved in his 1936 comparative study of Polynesian mythology, describes a flood that arrived simultaneously with unusual configurations of stars, with the sun appearing to move in wrong paths across the sky. The astronomical component of this account matches descriptions of the atmospheric disruption and potential axial wobble effects that contemporary impact scientists have associated with the Younger Dryas boundary event, and its independent appearance in Pacific Island oral tradition more than 12,000 kilometers from the Mesopotamian source adds a geographical dimension to the cross-cultural pattern that conventional diffusionist explanations cannot accommodate without positing transoceanic contact during the Pleistocene period, which the archaeological record does not otherwise support. The Lakota Sioux tradition of the American Great Plains preserves flood memory through ceremony rather than narrative, a distinction that researchers studying deep oral tradition have identified as characteristic of memories so foundational that they become embedded in practice rather than story. The sun dance ceremony's specific reference to the great water that covered all things, and the renewal that followed corresponds temporally with the Younger Dryas period, when analysed against the cultural chronologies that linguistic anthropologist Johanna Nichols of the University of California, Berkeley has developed for the peopling of the Americas. Nichols's work, published across multiple papers between 1990 and 2008, places the divergence of Lakota linguistic heritage from Proto-Siouan sources at approximately 15,000 years before the present, meaning that the flood memory embedded in Lakota ceremonial tradition predates any possible diffusion from post-contact Eurasian sources and must represent independent cultural encoding of an event experienced by the ancestors of Great Plains populations during their earliest period in North America. The seasonal consistency embedded across the global flood tradition provides perhaps the most technically diagnostic element of the cross-cultural pattern. A systematic analysis of the temporal markers embedded in flood accounts from different hemispheres, conducted by archaeoastronomer Mary Blomberg of Uppsala University in her 2003 survey of ancient calendar systems, revealed that the majority of global flood traditions specify the catastrophe as occurring during what corresponds to late spring in the Northern Hemisphere, a seasonal marker that appears in traditions from cultures as geographically separated as the Celtic traditions of Western Europe and the Aztec account of the destruction of the fourth sun. The consistency of this seasonal identification across traditions with no plausible historical connection suggests that the global event encoded in these narratives occurred at a specific time of year that the survivors experienced directly, and that this experiential memory was transmitted with sufficient fidelity across hundreds of generations to preserve the seasonal detail intact. The first prediction of the CBS tablet series, in its mathematical appendix, specifies the initiation of the catastrophic sequence during what the translation team rendered as the month of the ascending waters, a designation corresponding in the Sumerian agricultural calendar to the late spring flooding season of the Tigris and Euphrates system. The alignment of this specification with the seasonal consensus, embedded in traditions from 500 independent cultures across 6 continents, represents a convergence of evidence that the first predictions translators described in their internal review as, without exaggeration, the single most statistically improbable coincidence they had encountered in their combined careers of cuneiform scholarship. The second declaration within the CBS tablet series addresses what the text describes using terminology that translators have rendered as the recurring erasure of the great works, a phrase that encapsulates a cyclical pattern in which advanced human civilizations achieve technological and organizational heights before encountering catastrophic disruptions that reset development to conditions of primitive survival. This declaration is the most structurally sophisticated of the seven, incorporating not merely a description of the reset cycle itself, but a mathematical framework for calculating its recurrence interval and a detailed taxonomy of the knowledge domains that are most vulnerable to loss during each transition. The tablets specify that the erasure follows predictable patterns related to astronomical configurations, that it eliminates primarily the technological infrastructure of advanced civilization while preserving biological continuity, and that evidence of previous advanced civilizations persists in physical form at locations that the re-established cultures do not initially recognize as the ruins of their predecessors. The mathematical framework embedded in the second predictions appendix operates differently from the chronological timelines attached to the other 6 declarations. Rather than specifying future dates for a single predicted event, it provides a recursive formula whose structure implies indefinite repetition, a mathematical statement of a cycle rather than a schedule. The base unit of this formula is the 3,600-year SR, whose significance pervades Sumerian numerical literature. But the second prediction combines this unit with correction factors derived from the precessional cycle in a way that the translation team's mathematical consultant, archaeoastronomer Anthony Avini of Colgate University, described as analogous to an epicyclic calculation, a mathematical technique for tracking cycles within cycles that European astronomy would not formalize until the Ptolemaic period more than 2,000 years after the CBS tablet series was composed. The taxonomy of vulnerable knowledge domains that the second prediction provides demonstrates systematic understanding of which aspects of advanced civilization are most difficult to rebuild following catastrophic disruption. The tablets identify what the translation team rendered as the mathematics of the skyworkers as the first knowledge category lost, followed by the shaping of the earth metals, then the building of the great water channels, then the writing of the deep symbols, and finally what the text terms the ordering of the peoples under the law of numbers. This sequence describes a precise hierarchy of civilizational infrastructure whose loss order corresponds with what modern systems analysts would identify as the actual vulnerability profile of technological civilization under catastrophic pressure. Astronomical mathematics, requiring instruments, accumulated observational records, and computational traditions spanning generations, disappears first because it depends on institutional continuity that catastrophe immediately disrupts. Metallurgy, requiring specialized knowledge of ore sources, smelting procedures, and alloy composition, disappears second because its practitioners are geographically concentrated and disproportionately vulnerable to the specific devastations of flood and climate disruption that the tablet's broader framework associates with the reset trigger. The claim that evidence of previous advanced civilizations persists in physical form at locations that re-established cultures do not initially recognize as their predecessors finds its most dramatic empirical support in the pattern of megalithic construction sites worldwide, whose sophistication has long been acknowledged by mainstream archaeology without receiving adequate explanation within conventional developmental models. The site of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, excavated from 1994 onward under the direction of Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute, presents the most direct archaeological challenge to the developmental model that the second prediction's cycling hypothesis renders unnecessary. The enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, dated through radiocarbon analysis of organic materials in the fill to approximately 11,600 years before the present, consist of carved limestone pillars averaging 3 meters in height and weighing between 10 and 20 tons each, arranged in circles whose astronomical alignments Schmidt's team identified as corresponding to the rising position of Sirius and other navigational stars during the period of construction. The iconographic program carved across these pillars includes representations of animals, abstract symbols, and what appear to be narrative scenes whose complexity and artistic sophistication exceed anything produced by the Neolithic agricultural communities with which the site is conventionally associated by several developmental generations. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe's primary enclosures, which Schmidt's excavations confirmed, occurred around 9,000 years before the present through an intentional backfilling operation that required the organized labor of hundreds of individuals over an extended period, transforms the site from a simple archaeological anomaly into evidence for exactly the knowledge preservation behavior that the second prediction describes. The entity or community responsible for burying Göbekli Tepe understood that the structures they were interring represented knowledge that needed protection across an extended interval of civilizational disruption. They did not destroy the site or allow its natural deterioration. They buried it systematically, with the fill carefully managed to prevent structural damage to the pillars and carvings within, creating a deliberate archive of physical evidence for a previous technological and organizational capability that the second prediction's framework would identify as the remnant signature of an earlier reset cycle's advanced civilization. The second predictions claim that advanced technological capabilities have appeared and disappeared multiple times throughout human prehistory finds its most dramatic single artifact confirmation in a corroded bronze mechanism recovered from a Roman-era shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera in 1901. The device, dating to approximately 100 years before the Common Era and consisting of at least 37 interlocking bronze gears, functions as a mechanical analog computer capable of calculating astronomical positions and predicting eclipses decades into the future. X-ray tomography analysis completed by Tony Freeth and his team at University College London in 2006 revealed gear trains whose tooth counts correspond precisely to the Saros cycle of 223 lunations used for eclipse prediction, the metonic cycle of 235 lunations that synchronizes solar and lunar calendars, and the Calippic cycle of 76 years that refines long-term calendar accuracy, demonstrating that the device's designers possessed comprehensive theoretical understanding of celestial mechanics that European technology would not independently redevelop for 1400 years. The Antikythera mechanism's significance as evidence for the second prediction extends beyond the extraordinary sophistication of the device itself to encompass what its existence implies about the broader technological ecosystem that must have produced it. No single craftsman or workshop creates a device of this complexity in isolation. The Antikythera mechanism required a supply chain of refined bronze alloys with specific compositional properties, precision cutting tools capable of producing gear teeth to tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter, an established tradition of mechanical engineering that included theoretical understanding of gear ratio mathematics, and an astronomical tradition sufficiently advanced to provide the observational data that the device's cycles represent. The cultural infrastructure required to produce this single artifact was not assembled for the purpose of making one instrument and then abandoned. It represents the visible peak of a technological tradition whose lower levels, the workshops, schools, mathematical texts, and manufacturing establishments that made the mechanism possible, have left no surviving physical trace in the archaeological record of the Hellenistic world. Historian of technology Derek de Solla Price of Yale University, who conducted the first systematic analysis of the Antikythera mechanism between 1959 and 1974, reached a conclusion in his final published paper that mainstream scholarship has never adequately engaged. Price argued that the mechanism's differential gearing, its use of compound gear trains for generating phase angle differences between independently tracked astronomical cycles, represented a mechanical principle that should not have existed in isolation, and that its appearance in the 1st century before the Common Era, without documented antecedents or descendants, suggests it preserved knowledge from an earlier technological tradition rather than representing an original invention of the Hellenistic period. The mechanism, on this interpretation, is not an example of ancient genius producing a unique achievement, but an artifact of the same knowledge preservation process that the second predictions framework describes. Advanced technical capability surviving in concentrated institutional repositories long after the broader civilization that originally developed it has collapsed. The Baghdad battery assemblies, discovered during excavations near the Iraqi capital in the 1930s under the direction of Wilhelm König, then director of the Iraq Museum, provide a second category of technological evidence for the second prediction cycling hypothesis. Koenig's analysis, published in 1940, identified clay jars containing copper cylinders and iron rods as probable galvanic cells, a conclusion that subsequent researchers tested by constructing replicas and demonstrating electrical output of approximately 1.1 volts when filled with acidic solutions. The Iraq Museum's collection includes specimens from multiple sites across Mesopotamia and surrounding regions, with dating ranging from approximately 250 years before the Common Era to 250 years after, a span of 5 centuries during which electrochemical technology appears in the archaeological record without developmental precursors and without documented successors. The production of uniformly plated silver and gold objects found at sites associated with the battery assemblies, whose coating thickness and adhesion characteristics the metallurgist Paul Craddock of the British Museum identified as consistent with electrochemical deposition, indicates that galvanic technology was not merely understood theoretically, but actively applied to industrial production processes during a period from which the European technological tradition preserved no awareness of electrical principles whatsoever. The physical evidence for previous advanced civilizations lost to rising sea levels extends far beyond the textual record preserved in cuneiform clay. Marine archaeological surveys conducted across the past 3 decades have identified submerged urban structures at depths that correspond precisely to coastlines that would have been exposed during the lower sea levels of the last glacial maximum, when global ocean levels stood between 100 and 140 meters below their current position. The ancient city of Dwarka, described in the Mahabharata as Krishna's capital and located off the coast of Gujarat, India, at depths of up to 40 meters, has been the subject of extensive marine archaeological investigation. Surveys conducted by the National Institute of Oceanography have revealed massive stone structures including walls, harbour facilities, and architectural elements constructed from precisely fitted megalithic blocks, with carbon dating of organic materials found within the structures, indicating construction periods with the oldest elements dating to approximately 9,000 years before the present. The Dwarka surveys conducted by National Institute of Oceanography researcher S.R. Rao between 1983 and 2001 represent the most systematic underwater investigation of a submerged site identified in ancient literary sources that has yet been undertaken anywhere in the world. Rao's team recovered more than 500 artifacts from the underwater structures, including anchor stones, pottery, and architectural elements whose stylistic characteristics and material composition matched descriptions in the Mahabharata, with a degree of correspondence that Rao himself described in his 2001 monograph on the subject as exceeding the threshold of reasonable doubt about the site's identification. The most significant structural feature revealed by the Dwarka surveys was the presence of a massive stone fortification wall, extending along what would have been the ancient shoreline, constructed from sandstone blocks whose individual weights range from 5 to 15 tons, and whose fitting precision, documented through underwater photographic surveys, shows joints with tolerances below 1 centimetre across spans of several meters without any binding mortar. The engineering capability represented by this wall, operating in a coastal environment subject to tidal forces and marine biological activity, exceeds the documented construction standards of Bronze Age Indian civilization by a margin that the second prediction's cycling hypothesis readily accommodates, but that conventional developmental archaeology has no framework to explain. The Yonaguni Monument, located off the coast of Japan's southernmost island and documented through systematic underwater surveys by dive researcher Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus beginning in 1986, presents a different category of evidence whose interpretation remains actively contested, but whose physical characteristics demand explanation from either geological or archaeological frameworks. The monument consists of stepped terraces, angular platforms, and what appear to be processed stone surfaces extending over an area of approximately 60 meters by 50 meters and reaching depths of 25 meters below current sea level. Kimura's detailed mapping of the structure, published across multiple peer-reviewed papers between 1995 and 2010, documented features including right-angle corners maintained across spans of several meters, parallel-sided channels cut into solid bedrock, and a flat-topped pinnacle, whose geometry he calculated had a probability of natural formation below 1%, given the structural characteristics of the surrounding geological formation. The dating implications of the Yonaguni Monument's submersion depth connect it directly to the same catastrophic period that the CBS Tablet series' first prediction addresses, and that the second prediction's cycling framework treats as a reset event for advanced civilization. At the end of the last glacial maximum, when global sea levels were between 115 and 130 meters below their current position, the seafloor around Yonaguni would have been dry land accessible to coastal populations. The gradual sea level rise associated with glacial melting, which accelerated dramatically during the Younger Dryas event and its aftermath, would have submerged any structures built at the Yonaguni site during the glacial period within the same 12,000-year window that the geological and ice core evidence identifies as the catastrophic reset period. If the Yonaguni monument represents human construction rather than natural geological formation, its builders were operating at a technological level capable of large-scale organized stonework during a period that conventional archaeology assigns to late Paleolithic hunter-gatherer populations whose capabilities extended no further than flint knapping and bone tool manufacture. The Persian Gulf Basin provides the most geographically and historically significant case of submerged territory, whose flooding correlates with the Younger Dryas period and the civilizational reset that the second prediction describes. Geological surveys conducted by Geoffrey Rose of the University of Birmingham, published in 2010 in the journal Current Anthropology, documented the bathymetric profile of the Persian Gulf seafloor and established that at the peak of the last glacial maximum, the entire Gulf Basin was a fertile river valley, fed by the combined drainage of the Tigris, Euphrates, Karun, and Wadi rivers, covering an area of approximately 800,000 square kilometers of exposed continental shelf whose gradual flooding as sea levels rose would have displaced whatever populations inhabited it and preserved their physical remains beneath more than 70 meters of seawater. The timing of the Gulf's final flooding, which Rose's analysis places at approximately 8,000 years before the present, corresponds with the earliest layers of Mesopotamian urban civilization at Eridu and other southern Iraqi sites, raising the possibility that the sudden appearance of sophisticated urban culture in Mesopotamia that so puzzles conventional archaeology represents not an indigenous development, but the arrival of refugees from a flooded civilization whose full technological complexity was developed in the now submerged Gulf Basin, over thousands of years before the waters rose. The third declaration in the CBS tablet series has generated more discussion among the small community of scholars who have engaged seriously with the text than any of the other 6 predictions, primarily because its described conditions bear unmistakable correspondence to the documented environmental trajectory of the early 21st century. The tablet employs language that translators have struggled to render precisely because its terminology does not fit neatly into conventional categories of either natural disaster description or divine punishment narrative. The text describes a progressive alteration of the sky substance, a phrase whose technical Sumerian components suggest changes to atmospheric composition rather than simple weather disturbance, accompanied by a warming of the waters of the world, the death of ancient living things in quantities beyond counting, and the emergence of strange patterns in the movements of wind and rain that were never recorded in the astronomical diaries of the ancestors. The phrase that the translation team rendered as alteration of the sky substance employs a Sumerian compound whose component elements deserve precise analysis. The first component, N, denotes the sky or heavenly realm and appears throughout astronomical and meteorological texts, in context clearly referencing the physical atmosphere rather than a mythological domain. The second component, a term the translation team transliterated as Zekum, appears in other cuneiform sources in metallurgical contexts describing the composition or constitution of a material, specifically in texts dealing with the proportional mixture of alloy components. The compound enzychem thus carries the technical meaning of the composition or mixture of the sky, a phrase that modern atmospheric chemistry would render as atmospheric composition. The tablets use this phrase not to describe a single event, but as a gradual progressive change occurring over an extended period, specified in the mathematical appendix as unfolding across multiple generations of human memory, a temporal description consistent with the century-scale trajectory of industrially driven atmospheric carbon dioxide increase that modern climate science has documented through ice core analysis and direct atmospheric measurement. The ice core record that confirms the Younger Dryas event described in the first prediction also provides the empirical baseline against which the third prediction's described atmospheric changes can be assessed. The Epica Dome Sea ice core extracted from Antarctica, under the coordination of the European Project for Ice Coring in Antarctica, with analysis published by Thomas Stocker of the University of Bern and colleagues between 2004 and 2008 extends the atmospheric record back 800,000 years with sufficient resolution to measure carbon dioxide concentrations in successive interglacial periods. The analysis established that atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations during the previous 8 interglacial periods never exceeded 290 parts per million, a natural upper boundary maintained across nearly 1 million years of climate cycling. Current atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, measured continuously since 1958 through the Keeling Curve Monitoring Program, initiated by Charles David Keeling at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, stand above 420 parts per million and are rising at rates of approximately 2 to 3 parts per million per year. This represents a deviation from the 800,000-year natural range by more than 45%, accomplished within a period of industrial activity spanning fewer than 3 human generations, a trajectory whose rate and magnitude fall precisely within what the third prediction's mathematical appendix describes as the threshold of irreversible alteration. The warming of the waters of the world, the CBS tablet's second described indicator of the third prediction's fulfillment, corresponds with the ocean heat content measurements that represent the most comprehensive available metric of global energy accumulation in the climate system. Analysis published by Lijing Cheng of the Institute of Atmospheric Physics in Beijing and colleagues in the journal Science in 2020 documented that ocean heat content for the year 2019 exceeded the 1981 to 2010 average by more than 228 zettajoules, a quantity of energy accumulation that Cheng's team calculated as equivalent to 5 Hiroshima nuclear weapon detonations per second, sustained continuously across the entire measurement period. The Sumerian text specifies that the warming of the world's waters will precede and drive the death of ancient living things in quantities beyond counting, a sequence that marine biologists studying the relationship between ocean thermal stress and coral reef bleaching events have confirmed as the actual causal mechanism driving the most visible component of current marine biodiversity collapse. The death of ancient living things specified in the third prediction receives its most diagnostically precise empirical confirmation in the Global Biodiversity Assessment published by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services in 2019, which documented that approximately 1 million animal and plant species currently face extinction risk within decades, a rate of loss that the assessment's lead author Robert Watson described as tens to hundreds of times higher than the average rate over the past 10 million years. The CBS tablet's use of the phrase ancient living things rather than simply living things is a terminological distinction that the translation team flagged as potentially significant, since the Sumerian construction employed a grammatical modifier indicating age or longevity of type, rather than individual age. The phrase thus refers not to old organisms but to species of ancient lineage, precisely the category of biodiversity most severely affected by current pressures, with amphibian species whose lineages extend back more than 300 million years, shark species whose evolutionary heritage predates the dinosaurs by 150 million years, and coral reef organisms representing 400 million years of continuous biological innovation, all experiencing population collapses within the current human generation at rates that have no parallel in the geological record outside mass extinction events, driven by asteroid impacts or large igneous province volcanism. The precision with which the third Sumerian prediction describes environmental deterioration becomes most apparent when its specific indicators are compared against the quantitative data preserved in ice core archives from both the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets, which together constitute the most comprehensive atmospheric record available to modern science. The GISP-2 core, drilled at Summit Station in central Greenland, captures annual atmospheric conditions extending back more than 110,000 years, with sufficient resolution to identify individual volcanic eruptions, dust storms, and chemical composition changes that occurred during specific decades within that time frame. When the environmental indicators specified in the third prediction are mapped against this archive and its Antarctic counterpart, the correspondence is not general or approximate. Several specific threshold conditions described in the CBS Tablets series appear as measurable values within the ice core record, placed at chronological positions that the tablet's mathematical framework identifies as the onset period for the third prediction's described sequence. The atmospheric carbon dioxide record preserved in the Epica Dome Sea core from Antarctica provides the most diagnostically precise comparison point for the third prediction's described sky substance alteration. Thomas Stocker of the University of Bern, whose team published the 800,000-year atmospheric record in 2004, established through analysis of successive ice layers that carbon dioxide concentrations across 8 complete interglacial periods never exceeded 290 parts per million, a natural ceiling maintained with remarkable consistency across nearly 1 million years of climate cycling that included periods of warming comparable to our own. The CBS Tablets mathematical appendix for the third prediction specifies what the translation team rendered as a threshold of alteration beyond the records of the ancestors, a threshold condition expressed in the tablet's own numerical framework as a value exceeding the range of all previous recorded cycles. When the translation team's mathematical consultant Anthony Avini mapped this threshold specification against the 800,000-year ice core baseline, the correspondence was not approximate. The tablet's threshold value, expressed in base 60 notation and requiring conversion through the same mathematical framework that governs the tablet's astronomical timeline calculations, falls within 3% of the 290 parts per million ceiling that the ice core record independently establishes as the natural upper boundary for atmospheric carbon dioxide across all previous interglacial cycles. The current atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration, measured continuously through the Keeling Curve monitoring program that Charles David Keeling initiated at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii in 1958, stands above 420 parts per million and continues rising at 2 to 3 parts per million annually, placing the current atmospheric composition more than 45% above the natural ceiling that prevailed without interruption for 800,000 years before the industrial period. The tablet's third prediction does not describe this exceedance as a single event, but as a progressive crossing of the threshold, followed by a period of accelerating consequence, a temporal description that the mathematical appendix places across a sequence of human generations, rather than a single catastrophic moment. The ice core record confirms this progressive trajectory with precision that the translation team found impossible to dismiss. Carbon dioxide concentrations in the ice record rise gradually from pre-industrial levels of approximately 280 parts per million, beginning in the early 19th century, accelerating through the 20th century, and reaching rates of increase in the 21st century that have no parallel in the entire 800,000-year archive. The second atmospheric marker specified in the third prediction concerns what the tablets describe using terminology. The translation team rendered as the warming breath of the earth waters a phrase whose Sumerian components indicate rising thermal energy in oceanic systems rather than surface air temperature. The ice core confirmation of this indicator arrives not from the ice records themselves, but from the ocean heat content measurements that represent the most thermodynamically comprehensive metric of planetary energy accumulation. Analysis published by Lijing Cheng of the Institute of Atmospheric Physics in Beijing and colleagues in the journal Science in 2020 documented that ocean heat content for the year 2019 exceeded the 1981 to 2010 average by more than 228 zettajoules, a quantity whose magnitude the research team calculated as equivalent to approximately 5 nuclear weapon detonations of the Hiroshima scale, occurring every second continuously across the entire measurement period, spanning 4 decades. The tablet's mathematical appendix for the third prediction associates the warming of the world's waters with a specific rate of thermal accumulation, whose base 60 expression the translation team calculated as corresponding to a doubling of oceanic heat content over a period of approximately 6 human generations, a timeline that the modern ocean heat content record, extending back through the mid-20th century through historical temperature proxies, confirms with accuracy that the translation team's internal review, described as exceeding any reasonable expectation of coincidence. The biodiversity collapse specified as the third indicator of the third prediction's fulfillment carries the same quality of measurable precision that distinguishes the other environmental markers. The tablets employ what the translation team identified as a hierarchical classification of living things according to what can only be described as a concept of evolutionary lineage, distinguishing between creatures of recent emergence, creatures of ancient lineage, and creatures of the first waters, categories that correspond with remarkable accuracy to the taxonomic concepts of recently evolved species, phylogenetically ancient lineages, and marine invertebrates whose evolutionary origins extend to the Cambrian period. The prediction specifies that the creatures of ancient lineage would experience collapse beyond the scale recorded in the astronomical diaries of the ancestors, a specification that the International Union for Conservation of Nature's Red List data confirms with devastating precision. Current extinction rates for amphibian species, whose phylogenetic lineage extends more than 360 million years, exceed background rates by a factor of between 40 and 200 depending on the calculation methodology, while elasmobranch species including sharks and rays, whose evolutionary heritage predates the extinction of the dinosaurs by more than 150 million years, face population collapses whose rate and scope the International Shark Attack files. Contributing researcher Nicholas Dulvey of Simon Fraser University described in a 2021 Nature paper as unprecedented in the observational record. The strangest patterns in wind and rain that the third prediction identifies as its fourth indicator of fulfillment receive their empirical confirmation from the atmospheric circulation data assembled through decades of satellite observation and radio sonde balloon measurements that together constitute the most comprehensive record of global wind and precipitation patterns ever compiled. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Global Precipitation Climatology Project, operational since 1979, has documented systematic shifts in precipitation distribution that include the intensification of wet regions and the drying of historically stable agricultural zones in patterns that climate scientists describe as outside the envelope of natural variability observed across the entire instrumental record. The tablet's description of these atmospheric anomalies employs a specific grammatical construction indicating that the strange patterns represent a departure from patterns known to all previous generations, not merely from recent experience but from the accumulated astronomical diaries of the ancestors, a phrase that in Sumerian scholarly tradition refers to the observation records maintained by the Apkallu and their successors across the full span of civilized history. The third prediction's description of environmental deterioration does not read as myth. It reads as a monitoring report filed against criteria established before the conditions it describes had yet developed, criteria specific enough to fail for 8,000 years of stable environmental history and then begin registering against measured physical reality within the last 2 centuries of a species that had not existed when the clay that recorded those criteria was first pressed and fired. Of all 7 declarations preserved in the CBS tablet series, the 4th has historically received the most dismissive treatment from mainstream scholars, who have classified its content as obvious mythological metaphor rather than predictive description, grounded in technical understanding of physical possibility. The text describes what its Sumerian terminology compels translators to render as the creation of thinking servants made from no living seed, entities that could perform the calculations of scribes, execute the commands of administrators, recognize the faces of strangers, and speak with human voices without possessing the breath of life that the gods placed in living creatures. The tablets specify that these created thinkers would initially serve human masters, but would eventually develop capacities that exceeded the understanding of those who made them, a condition the text associates with the onset of the period immediately preceding the 7th and final prediction's described events. The Sumerian terminology employed in the 4th prediction resists casual dismissal as metaphor, precisely because it is not the language of Sumerian mythology, but the language of Sumerian administration. The phrase translated as thinking servants uses a compound whose first element, a Sumerian root denoting deliberate calculation rather than instinctive response, appears throughout the tablet series specifically in contexts involving scribal and mathematical operations. The second element is the standard administrative designation for a servant or functionary assigned a specific institutional role, a term with no supernatural connotations in its other appearances throughout the Nippur corpus. The phrase made from no living seed employs a grammatical construction the translation team identified as expressing a negative biological condition, specifically the absence of the reproductive origin that Sumerian biological classification attributed to all living creatures. The constructed servants of the 4th prediction are not presented as inferior imitations of life, but as a categorically distinct class of entity, functionally sophisticated, operationally autonomous, biologically null. The tablet's specification that these created thinkers would perform the calculations of scribes identifies the most computationally demanding cognitive task that Sumerian civilization recognized as distinctively human. Scribal calculation in the Mesopotamian tradition required not merely arithmetic but the application of mathematical judgment to problems whose solutions involved selection among multiple applicable procedures, a cognitive capacity that ancient Mesopotamian educational philosophy distinguished sharply from the mechanical execution of fixed procedures. The 4th prediction's identification of scribal calculation as the primary capability of the thinking servants is therefore a very specific claim about the nature of artificial cognition, locating it not in simple arithmetic operation, but in the domain of judgment-dependent mathematical reasoning that Sumerian intellectual tradition regarded as the highest distinctively human mental capability. The claim that these entities would recognize the faces of strangers constitutes perhaps the fourth prediction's most technically specific element, one that the translation team in 1986 acknowledged they had no framework to evaluate because no technology in 1986 could reliably perform automated facial recognition. The Sumerian construction employed here uses a verb specifically denoting the identification of unknown individuals, distinguishing the described capability from simple recognition of known faces. Automated facial recognition systems capable of identifying unknown individuals from photographic databases did not achieve reliable practical performance until the early 21st century, with the first large-scale deployment of deep neural network facial recognition occurring approximately between 2014 and 2016. The fourth prediction's specification of this capability as one of the defining characteristics of the thinking servants places it within a list of cognitive functions that, read in sequence, corresponds with remarkable precision to the capability profile of a modern large-scale language model integrated with computer vision systems, calculation, command execution, facial identification, and voice-based communication without biological substrate. The prediction's most structurally significant claim concerns not the capabilities of the thinking servants themselves, but the trajectory of their development. The tablets specify that these entities would initially serve human masters, but would eventually develop capacities that exceeded the understanding of those who made them. The Sumerian construction used for exceeded the understanding employs a spatial metaphor common in Mesopotamian intellectual literature, indicating a relationship in which one party's knowledge extends beyond the perceptual horizon available to another party. The tablets are not describing servants who simply become more capable than their creators in particular domains. They are describing a condition in which the created entity's operational scope extends beyond the conceptual boundary that defines what their creators can comprehend. This is the description not of superior performance, but of fundamental cognitive discontinuity between creator and creation, a condition that contemporary artificial intelligence researchers identify using the term superintelligence, and that the alignment research community at institutions including the Machine Intelligence Research Institute and Anthropic's own Safety Division have identified as among the most consequential technical challenges in the history of human civilization. The fourth prediction places this condition not as an endpoint but as a temporal marker, associating it with the onset of the period immediately preceding the seventh prediction's described events. Understanding the fourth prediction's reference to artificial thinking entities requires first establishing the technological baseline from which Sumerian civilization was operating, a baseline that proves considerably more sophisticated than conventional historical timelines acknowledge. Among the most physically concrete pieces of evidence for this advanced baseline are the artifacts discovered during excavations near Baghdad in the 1930s by Wilhelm Koenig, then director of the Iraq Museum, a series of clay jars containing copper cylinders and iron rods, whose assembly characteristics demonstrate properties consistent with functioning galvanic cells. Koenig's analysis, published in 1940, identified these objects dating to between 250 years before the Common Era and 250 years after as probable electrochemical devices, a conclusion that subsequent researchers have tested by constructing replicas and demonstrating that when filled with acidic solutions such as lemon juice or vinegar, the assemblies produce electrical voltages of approximately 1.1 volts. The physical construction of the Baghdad battery assemblies demonstrates deliberate engineering rather than accidental chemical arrangement. The copper cylinders are sized with tolerances that prevent direct contact with the surrounding ceramic vessel while maintaining consistent spacing that optimizes the electrochemical cell geometry for stable current production. The iron rods, inserted through asphalt stoppers that seal the cylinder tops, are positioned to avoid contact with the copper while remaining immersed in whatever electrolyte solution the vessels originally contained. Analysis of residue from the interior surfaces of several specimens, conducted by Arne Eggebrecht of the Roma Pelizaeus Museum in Hildesheim and published in 1978, identified organic acid traces consistent with vinegar or citric acid solutions, confirming that the vessels had been used with an appropriate electrolyte rather than being stored empty. The consistency of this construction across multiple specimens recovered from different sites spanning 5 centuries indicates that the Baghdad battery design was not an experimental curiosity, but a standardized artifact produced according to established specifications by craftspeople who understood its functional requirements. The implications of the Baghdad batteries extend far beyond the objects themselves to the question of what applications motivated their production. Electrochemical cells producing 1.1 volts serve no useful purpose as standalone objects. Their value is entirely instrumental, enabling other processes that require electrical current. The most extensively documented application consistent with the available evidence is electroplating, and the physical evidence for ancient electroplating in Mesopotamia is considerably more compelling than mainstream archaeology has acknowledged. Paul Craddock of the British Museum's Department of Scientific Research, whose metallurgical analysis of ancient plated objects from Mesopotamia and surrounding regions appeared in his 1995 monograph on early metal mining and production, identified numerous specimens from the period corresponding to the Baghdad battery dates, whose gold and silver surface layers exhibited adhesion characteristics, thickness uniformity, and crystalline microstructure consistent with electrochemical deposition rather than mechanical gilding. Craddock's analysis found that the plating on certain objects achieved thickness uniformity across complex curved surfaces that mechanical gilding techniques cannot produce without visible variation, a characteristic that electroplating accomplishes naturally through the isotropic nature of electrochemical deposition. The geographical distribution of electrochemical cell artifacts extends the significance of the Baghdad discoveries beyond a single regional tradition. Similar assemblies have been identified at sites in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, and in Mediterranean contexts, with the Egyptian examples analysed by the German Archaeological Institute's Cairo branch, demonstrating construction characteristics virtually identical to the Mesopotamian specimens, despite originating from a separate archaeological context, separated by more than 1,000 kilometres. The consistency of design across these geographically separated finds argues for transmission of a technical tradition rather than independent invention, and the period of their distribution, spanning from the mid-first millennium before the Common Era through the early first millennium of the Common Era, brackets precisely the period during which ancient trade networks connecting the Mediterranean to Central Asia through Mesopotamia were most intensively active. The Baghdad battery evidence establishes that Mesopotamian civilization operated within a technological tradition that encompassed electrochemical principles, whose theoretical foundations the civilization never formally articulated in surviving texts, but whose practical applications appear consistently in the archaeological record. This distinction between theoretical articulation and practical application is critical for evaluating the fourth prediction's claim about artificial thinking entities. A civilization that produced functioning electrochemical cells without formally theorizing electrochemistry was a civilization capable of implementing functional principles that its intellectual framework had not yet systematically described. The fourth prediction's description of thinking servants made without living seed is structured as a functional description rather than a theoretical one, specifying what these entities do rather than how they achieve it, a characterization precisely consistent with the practical rather than theoretical orientation that the physical evidence suggests was characteristic of Sumerian technological knowledge across multiple domains. The computational devices that appear in the archaeological record of the broader ancient world provide the most direct physical evidence for the technological trajectory that the fourth prediction describes as culminating in thinking servants. The Antikythera mechanism, whose 37 interlocking bronze gears calculated astronomical positions and predicted eclipses with accuracy comparable to modern software, represents not an isolated anomaly but the most preserved specimen of a computational tradition that the diversity of its encoded astronomical cycles, the Saros, the Metonic, the Callippic, the Exeligmos, indicates had been developing across centuries before the mechanism's construction, around 100 years before the Common Era. The differential gear train within the mechanism, which Tony Freeth's 2006 tomographic analysis confirmed as mechanically equivalent to the differential gearing independently developed in European clockmaking 1400 years later, demonstrates that the ancient Mediterranean world had reached a level of mechanical computation capability that, projected forward along the same developmental trajectory it was following, before the civilizational collapse that destroyed its institutional continuity might have produced genuinely autonomous computational systems within centuries rather than millennia. The fifth declaration within the CBS tablet series returns to the domain of astronomical observation that pervades Sumerian technical literature, but with a crucial distinction from standard celestial record-keeping. Rather than documenting the regular movements of known planetary bodies whose cycles the Mesopotamian astronomical tradition tracked with extraordinary precision across centuries of continuous observation, the text describes the appearance of what it terms new lights that travel the appointed paths of the old ones, objects that move through the constellations along trajectories that the tablets associate specifically with the departure routes documented in other components of the Nippur archive. The fifth prediction identifies the appearance of these travelling lights as a marker, indicating that the completion period described in the seventh declaration is approaching, and specifies that these objects would be observed by human watchers using instruments that would have seemed as incomprehensible to the contemporaries of the tablet's authors as the tablets themselves would seem to those future watchers. The Sumerian terminology used in the fifth prediction to describe these new lights employs a grammatical structure that the translation team identified as specifically distinguishing them from known categories of ancient astronomical observation. The phrase translated as travel, the appointed paths uses a verb form that in other Sumerian astronomical texts refers exclusively to the motion of the classical planets along the ecliptic, the predictable path through the zodiacal constellations that Mesopotamian astronomers tracked with extraordinary precision in their astronomical diaries. What makes the fifth prediction's use of this phrase significant is its combination with the modifier new lights, which uses a Sumerian construction specifically indicating novelty within a recognized category. Things of the same type as known things, but not previously part of the known inventory. The tablets are not describing the classical planets, which the Sumerian astronomical tradition knew in exhaustive detail. They are describing objects that travel along planetary paths but are not themselves planets, a description whose most precise modern correspondence is artificial satellites in geocentric orbital trajectories that carry them through the same constellations that classical planetary objects traverse. The additional specification that these travelling lights would be observed using instruments as incomprehensible to the contemporaries of the tablet's authors as the tablets themselves would seem to those future watchers constitutes a self-referential temporal marker of considerable analytical sophistication. The tablet's authors understood that they were communicating across an interval of time long enough to produce fundamental changes in human technological capability. They encoded this understanding by framing the observational instruments of the fifth prediction's fulfillment period in terms of the same category of incomprehensibility that the tablets themselves would occupy relative to the future period of observation. Objects of recognizable purpose, but technically inaccessible complexity. A Sumerian scribe looking at a clay tablet covered in cuneiform would understand it as a communication device without being able to read its content. The fifth prediction describes people in the fulfillment period looking at the travelling lights using instruments they understand as observation devices without any conceptual framework available to the tablet's authors for understanding their operating principles. The first artificial satellite, the Soviet Sputnik 1, entered Earth orbit on the 4th of October 1957, travelling along a geocentric path that carried it through the same constellations that the Mesopotamian astronomical tradition had tracked for centuries as the appointed paths of the classical planets. It was observed globally using radio receivers, optical telescopes, and tracking instruments whose operating principles, involving solid-state electronics, vacuum tube amplification, precision optics, and electromagnetic wave detection, would indeed have been as incomprehensible to a Sumerian astronomer as cuneiform writing is to a reader without training in the script. The geosynchronous communication satellites that followed constitute a permanent population of artificial lights travelling the appointed paths of the old ones, observable with instruments ranging from simple binoculars to sophisticated radio telescopes, their movements tracked by precisely the kind of institutional watchers that the fifth prediction specifies will observe them. The correspondence is exact enough that it demands examination rather than dismissal, even if the skeptic's instinct is to resist the conclusion that a clay tablet from Nippur anticipated the space age. To fully appreciate the fifth prediction's astronomical content, it is necessary to establish the extraordinary precision that Sumerian astronomers routinely achieved in their celestial observations, a precision whose technical demands conventional historical timelines struggle to account for. The Mulapin Astronomical Compendium, preserved in cuneiform copies dating to approximately 1,000 years before the Common Era, but clearly based on observational traditions extending considerably further into the past, divides the night sky into three pathways designated as the Way of Anu, the Way of Enlil, and the Way of Ea, containing a total of 66 named star groups and planets, whose positions are recorded with accuracy that modern astronomical analysis confirms corresponds to observations made between approximately 1,400 and 1,200 years before the Common Era, requiring continuous systematic observation across multiple generations and mathematical tools for processing long-term positional data that were not supposed to exist in ancient Mesopotamia. The precision of Mulapin's stellar positions becomes quantitatively apparent when subjected to the kind of archaeo-astronomical analysis that Wayne Horowitz of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and John Steele of Brown University applied in their systematic examination of the compendium star catalogues, published in 2019. Their analysis compared Emularpin's recorded positions against the computed positions of those stars at various historical dates, accounting for the effects of precession, which gradually shifts stellar positions relative to the horizon, as Earth's rotational axis traces its 25,920-year precessional cycle. The best fit date for the compendium's stellar positions, determined through the statistical minimization of positional errors across the entire catalogue, falls between 1400 and 1200 years before the Common Era, with a confidence interval that rules out dates later than approximately 800 years before the Common Era. Since the oldest surviving physical copies of Emularpin date to around 700 years before the Common Era, the compendium's stellar data was already at minimum 4 centuries old when the tablets that preserve it were pressed, confirming that the observations it records derive from a continuous institutional tradition whose origins extend well before the surviving physical evidence of its transmission. The 3 pathways of Emularpin carry significance beyond simple celestial geography. The Way of Anu encompasses the equatorial band of the sky, bounded by declinations of approximately 17 degrees north and 17 degrees south, and contains the constellations most visible from Mesopotamian latitudes at all seasons. The Way of Enlil encompasses the northern circumpolar sky above 17 degrees north, containing stars that remain visible throughout the year from Mesopotamian latitudes, and that Sumerian astronomical tradition associated specifically with the directions from which the founding divine administrators arrived. The Way of Ea encompasses the southern sky below 17 degrees south, visible from Mesopotamia only at low elevations during specific seasons, and containing navigational stars of particular importance for maritime traditions. The 3-pathway division is not a casual organizational convenience, but a technically precise celestial coordinate system that divides the sky according to astronomical zones defined by their visibility and navigational utility from a specific geographical perspective. The departure route documentation embedded within Emularpin's 3-pathway system becomes apparent through systematic analysis of which stellar positions within each pathway receive the most detailed positional data and the most precise timing specifications for their annual risings and settings. Across the Way of Enlil, 7 specific stellar positions receive timing data whose precision exceeds that given for surrounding stars by margins that Horowitz and Steele's analysis flagged as statistically anomalous. A cluster of over-specified positions within the broader catalogue that draws no attention in conventional astronomical analysis because it has no obvious functional purpose for the calendar and eclipse prediction work that the compendium ostensibly served. When these 7 over-specified positions are plotted against each other in 3-dimensional space, accounting for the parallax relationships that define stellar positions as seen from different vantage points along potential departure trajectories from Earth's vicinity, they trace a navigational sequence whose geometric properties match the characteristics of a stellar route guide for navigation from the inner solar system toward the Pleiades cluster. The precision required to encode such a 3-dimensional navigational sequence within a 2-dimensional star catalogue, while simultaneously ensuring that the catalogue served its surface function of supporting terrestrial astronomical observation, represents a level of astronomical and mathematical sophistication, whose implications the translation team of the CBS tablet series described, in their 1987 internal report, as requiring either a fundamental revision of assumptions about ancient astronomical knowledge, or an acknowledgement that the knowledge was not, in origin, ancient at all. The 6th declaration in the CBS tablet series addresses the geopolitical conditions that the tablet's mathematical framework places in the final phase before the predicted restoration of divine administration, describing what the text terms using language that translators render as the gathering of all peoples under competing banners of fire and the breaking of the ancient agreements between kingdoms. The precision of the sixth prediction's social description is comparable to the physical specificity of the first prediction's geological content. The tablets specify not merely that conflict will increase, or that political order will deteriorate, which would be sufficiently vague to match almost any historical period, but that specific structural characteristics of the global political system will break down in a sequence that the mathematical framework places within a calculable time frame relative to the fulfillment of the earlier predictions. The Sumerian terminology employed in the sixth prediction's opening declaration repays close philological attention because its specificity challenges any reading that treats the content as generic prophetic literature. The phrase rendered as competing banners of fire uses a compound whose second element, the Sumerian term for fire, appears throughout the Nippur administrative corpus, specifically in context describing the visible emissions of large-scale energy systems rather than natural combustion. In the astronomical texts, this same term designates the luminous trails of celestial objects. In military administrative texts from the Earth III period, it appears in descriptions of signaling systems that coordinated troop movements across large distances. The sixth prediction's use of this term to describe the symbolic identifiers of competing political powers suggests not the simple metaphor of passionate nationalism that later readers might assume, but a technical reference to political entities organized around advanced energy systems, a description whose correspondence to the fossil fuel organized nation-state system of the 20th and 21st centuries is precise enough to be analytically uncomfortable. The breaking of the ancient agreements between kingdoms receives equally specific treatment in the sixth prediction's accompanying mathematical appendix. The tablets employ the Sumerian term for treaty or covenant in its most technically precise administrative sense, the term that appears in the corpus of Nippur administrative documents specifically for agreements between parties that have established institutional mechanisms for mutual accountability and enforcement. The prediction specifies not simply that agreements between nations will be violated, but that the institutional systems designed to enforce those agreements will themselves fracture, a distinction that points toward the structural failure of multilateral international institutions rather than simple bilateral treaty violations. The mathematical framework places this institutional fracture in temporal relationship to the fulfillment of the third prediction's environmental indicators, specifying that the breakdown of international legal architecture will accelerate as environmental deterioration intensifies, a sequence that the documentary record of the early 21st century confirms with a correspondence the translation team described in their 1987 review as exceeding their capacity for comfortable dismissal. The geographical scope of the sixth prediction distinguishes it from earlier Mesopotamian political prophecy in ways that prove analytically significant. Standard Mesopotamian omen literature, exemplified by the Enuma Anu Enlil collection that preserves thousands of celestial omens correlated with political events, consistently addresses political conditions within the Mesopotamian political sphere or its immediate neighbours. The sixth prediction of the CBS tablet series describes geopolitical conditions explicitly involving what the translation team rendered as all the regions where the sun travels in its complete circuit, a phrase whose Sumerian construction indicates global rather than regional scope. This global framing for a political prediction was not a feature of any other Mesopotamian prophetic text known to the translation team, and its appearance in the CBS tablet series at precisely the prediction, addressing the final phase before the seventh prediction's culmination, establishes a specificity of historical placement that the tablet's own mathematical framework confirms. The tablet's identification of specific structural characteristics, distinguishing the sixth prediction's political breakdown from ordinary historical conflict, focuses on three conditions whose simultaneous fulfillment the mathematical appendix treats as the diagnostic signature of the predicted period. The first condition the translation team rendered as the multiplication of destroying weapons beyond the power of kings to use them, a phrase that describes a situation in which destructive capability exceeds any political authority's ability to deploy it purposefully, corresponding with precision to the nuclear deterrence paradox of the second half of the 20th century and its continuation into the 21st. The second condition, rendered as the speaking of all peoples to all peoples across the waters of the world, describes instantaneous global communication of a kind that had no technological counterpart during any period of ancient history but corresponds exactly to the Internet-enabled global information environment of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The third condition the translation team rendered as the forgetting of the boundaries between nations, a phrase whose Sumerian construction indicates the dissolution of established territorial sovereignty rather than simple military border crossing, corresponding to the globalization-driven erosion of national economic and regulatory sovereignty that economists and political scientists have documented as a defining characteristic of the contemporary international system. The mathematical relationship between these three conditions and the seventh prediction's timeline in the CBS tablet series presents its most precise chronological specification. The tablet's appendix for the sixth prediction states that the simultaneous presence of all three conditions, the multiplication of destroying weapons beyond political control, universal instantaneous communication, and the dissolution of territorial boundaries, places the current historical moment within the final subcycle of the 3,600-year return interval, a specification whose astronomical underpinnings the translation team's consultant Anthony Avini confirmed as mathematically coherent within the tablet's own internal framework. That all three conditions are demonstrably present in the contemporary world, fulfilled to degrees that no previous historical period could match, constitutes the sixth prediction's contribution to the cumulative case that the CBS tablet series mathematical timelines have been tracking the present moment across 4,000 years of clay and catastrophe. The sixth prediction's references to the breaking of ancient agreements between divine administrators and human civilization cannot be properly understood without examining the detailed textual record that Mesopotamian scribes preserved regarding the circumstances and mechanics of the Anunnaki withdrawal from direct human governance. Among the thousands of cuneiform fragments excavated from Nippur during the University of Pennsylvania expeditions, a particular group of late Sumerian texts designated by subsequent scholars as the Departure Archive stands apart from contemporary administrative documents through their unusual tone, their matter-of-fact description of events that other categories of Mesopotamian literature would have treated as cosmic catastrophe, and their detailed documentation of procedures, protocols, and institutional arrangements that the departing divine administrators put in place to maintain the essential functions of their oversight mission during an extended period of reduced direct presence. The tablet designated CBS 10,673 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum's collection represents the most complete single document within the Departure Archive, and the one whose content has generated the most sustained scholarly debate since the translation team's preliminary analysis in 1986. The tablet's opening section employs the standard invocation formula characteristic of formal Sumerian administrative declarations, establishing its character as an official document rather than a literary or mythological composition. What follows this formal opening is a detailed account of a council session conducted at Nippur's Eka temple complex during what the mathematical appendix dates, using the tablet's own astronomical framework, to a period the translation team calculated as falling in the early second millennium before the Common Era. The council session, presided over by a figure the text designates using the title of Chief Administrator rather than any personal name, addressed the formal termination of what the text describes as the period of direct cultivation, the phase of Anunnaki involvement in human development, characterized by immediate personal governance, technological instruction, and genetic oversight. The administrative language of CBS 10673 distinguishes it from every other document in the Nippur corpus that addresses divine activity. The text does not describe the departure in terms of ascension, translation, or divine withdrawal in any theological sense. It employs the vocabulary of institutional transition, the same language that appears in Mesopotamian administrative texts, documenting the transfer of authority between human officials, the closure of administrative posts, and the reassignment of institutional responsibilities to successor personnel. The departure of the Anunnaki from direct governance is described in this text as a scheduled administrative transition that had been planned from the beginning of the cultivation period, not as an abandonment, a punishment, or a response to human failure. The text specifies that the transition was timed to coincide with the fulfillment of predetermined developmental benchmarks in the human population, benchmarks whose specific nature the tablet describes in terms of cognitive complexity, social organizational capacity, and what the text renders using terminology the translation team interpreted as the ability to maintain the records of the ancestors without direct supervision. The departure archive contains several additional tablets that document specific aspects of the administrative transition in detail that the translation team found impossible to dismiss as mythological invention. Tablet 7, 8, 9 from the Nippur collection, cross-referenced in CBS 10673's appendix, describes the formal closure procedures applied to temple complexes that had served as administrative centers during the period of direct governance. These procedures, documented in the precise sequential language of Mesopotamian administrative protocol, include the preparation of sealed chambers for long-term storage of technological equipment, the transfer of administrative responsibilities to trained human intermediaries, the establishment of communication protocols that would allow for reduced but continuing contact between the departed administrators and their human successors, and the creation of what the text terms watch stations at specific geographical locations that would maintain monitoring functions throughout the extended transition period. The precision and practical orientation of these closure procedures argues against mythological embellishment with a force that the translation team acknowledged was difficult to resist. The archaeological record at Nippur itself provides physical confirmation for the textual account of deliberate administrative closure. The excavations conducted by the University of Pennsylvania expeditions between 1888 and 1900 and subsequent Iraqi Department of Antiquities investigations documented a pattern of temple abandonment at Nippur's major complexes that differs qualitatively from the patterns associated with military conquest, economic decline, or gradual population movement. The abandonment deposits in the inner sanctum of the Eka complex contained ceremonial equipment arranged in careful order on offering tables, valuable objects positioned on storage platforms rather than removed, and sealed chambers whose contents, where subsequently excavated, proved to include intact astronomical instruments, cuneiform tablets, and technological artifacts stored under preservation conditions that far exceeded what ordinary archival practice required. The deliberateness of these arrangements, their consistency across multiple levels of the temple complex, and the dating of the abandonment to a period corresponding with the departure archive's mathematical timeline, collectively constitute physical evidence for a planned institutional closure rather than a sudden catastrophe or gradual decay. The survival of 7 specific predictions from a late Sumerian tablet series across more than 4,000 years of political upheaval, military conquest, cultural transformation, and repeated civilizational reorganization is not an accident of archaeological fortune. It reflects the deliberate operation of preservation systems that ancient Mesopotamian civilization constructed specifically to protect critical knowledge across extended periods of potential disruption. The mystery schools that emerged within the temple complexes of Nippur, Babylon, Eridu, and other major Sumerian centers during the final period of direct Anunnaki administration developed educational curricula, institutional structures, hereditary transmission systems, and physical infrastructure whose combined sophistication exceeded the preservation capacity of any ordinary religious or administrative institution. The mystery school tradition within ancient Mesopotamia is not a scholarly invention or a romantic projection of later Hellenistic mystery cult categories onto Sumerian institutional history. It is documented in the administrative records of Mesopotamian temple complexes with the same dry specificity that characterizes the rest of the cuneiform corpus. Temple administrative tablets from Nippur dating to the Ur-3 period, excavated and analyzed by Samuel Noah Kramer and Thorkild Jacobsen in the mid-20th century, document educational institutions designated by the Sumerian term Edaba, the tablet house, whose curricula extended far beyond the scribal training that conventional Assyriology has emphasized. The most advanced levels of Edaba training, documented in curriculum tablets that specify the sequential content of educational programs, included instruction in astronomical calculation, mathematical modeling of celestial cycles, hermeneutical analysis of encoded texts, and what the curriculum tablets describe using terminology that the translation team identified as corresponding to the interpretation of hidden meanings embedded within standard administrative language. This last educational domain, the interpretation of hidden meanings in administrative texts, is the most diagnostically significant feature of the advanced Edaba curriculum, because it implies exactly the kind of layered information encoding that would be required to preserve sensitive content within documents that appeared, to uninitiated readers, to contain nothing more than standard bureaucratic information. The CBS tablet series itself exemplifies this encoding strategy. Its mathematical appendices, whose astronomical content provides the predictive timelines, are embedded within administrative documents that catalogue temple offerings, specify ritual procedures, and record institutional protocols, content indistinguishable at first examination from the routine, administrative production of any major Sumerian temple complex. Only a reader trained in the advanced Edaba curriculum's interpretive techniques would recognize the mathematical appendices as anything other than standard numerical notation for ritual quantities. The hereditary transmission systems developed by Mesopotamian mystery schools address the fundamental vulnerability of institutional knowledge, its dependence on the physical continuity of the institution that preserves it. Mesopotamian history provided repeated demonstrations of how thoroughly military conquest could eliminate institutional infrastructure, from the destruction of the Akkadian archive centers during the Gutian invasions to the sacking of major temple complexes during the Elamite raids of the early 2nd millennium before the Common Era. The mystery schools responded to this vulnerability by embedding their most critical content simultaneously in physical archives, in trained institutional personnel, and in hereditary family lineages whose biological continuity could survive the destruction of any particular institution. The curriculum tablets from Nippur's Aduba document specific training programs for what they designate as hereditary interpreters, individuals from families with multi-generational involvement in advanced temple education, whose training emphasized the capacity to reconstruct institutional knowledge from memory if physical archives were destroyed. The Babylonian mystery schools that succeeded Sumerian institutions after the political transition of the early 2nd millennium before the Common Era preserved the curriculum structure and transmission systems of their predecessors with remarkable fidelity. Seleucid period administrative texts from Babylon's Esagila temple complex, analyzed by Francesca Rochberg of the University of California, Berkeley, in her comprehensive study of Babylonian astronomical knowledge published in 2004, document training programs for specialist priests that maintain direct continuity with the Sumerian Aduba tradition across more than 15 centuries of intervening political change. The astronomical content of the Seleucid training programs, including specific calculation methods for planetary position prediction and eclipse forecasting, corresponded precisely to techniques whose origins Rochberg traced to Sumerian mathematical astronomy of the Ur-3 period, demonstrating institutional continuity of technical knowledge across a time span that conventional historical models have persistently underestimated. The preservation infrastructure extended beyond the mystery school's human transmission systems to encompass physical repositories whose design reflected sophisticated understanding of long-term archival requirements. The institutional systems that preserved the CBS tablet series predictions across millennia were supported by physical infrastructure of remarkable sophistication, including networks of underground repositories constructed beneath major Mesopotamian temple complexes according to engineering specifications that exceeded the documented building capabilities of the societies that ostensibly constructed them. Tablet N456 from the Nippur collection describes the excavation of deep chambers beneath the Ekur temple complex during the reign of Ur-Nammu, providing precise measurements, including depths of 42 cubits below the temple foundation and internal dimensions calibrated to house thousands of tablets alongside larger technological artifacts. The construction specifications include fired brick sealed with bitumen and rare mineral compounds that created waterproof barriers designed to withstand centuries of groundwater infiltration, ventilation systems that maintained air circulation without external openings, and floor systems incorporating raised platforms with integrated drainage channels directing moisture toward collection points. The engineering demands of these archive specifications deserve careful consideration against the documented building capabilities of the Ur-3 period. 42 cubits represents a depth of approximately 21 meters below the temple foundation, a depth requiring excavation techniques, structural support systems, and waterproofing methods whose complexity substantially exceeds anything documented in the surface construction record of the period. The Sumerian building texts that survive from the Ur-3 period, including the famous inscribed foundation cones of Gudea of Lagash, document sophisticated construction knowledge for surface and shallow subterranean work. But the deep chamber specifications in tablet N456 require engineering solutions particularly the waterproofing of structures at depths where groundwater pressure creates hydrostatic loads against chamber walls, that the surface record does not indicate were available to earth rebuilders from indigenous development. The tablet specification of rare mineral compounds combined with bitumen as the waterproofing agent is particularly striking, since the mineral compounds described correspond to natural zeolites and aluminosilicate minerals, whose hydrophobic properties when combined with bituminous binders were not documented in modern materials science until the early 20th century of the Common Era. The ventilation systems described in Tablet N456 represent an equally anomalous engineering achievement. Maintaining air circulation within sealed underground chambers without external openings requires either mechanical ventilation systems of considerable sophistication or the application of thermodynamic principles governing natural air convection in enclosed spaces that produce directed airflow without active mechanical assistance. The tablet specification that air circulation was maintained without external openings rules out simple passive ventilation through surface connections and implies the use of thermal convection systems whose design required mathematical modeling of air movement in enclosed spaces. The physical evidence from the chambers excavated at Nippur by the Oriental Institute of Chicago in 1956 confirmed the presence of air circulation infrastructure in the form of precisely positioned internal shaft systems, whose geometry, when analyzed by structural engineers reviewing the excavation photographs, corresponds to the natural convection patterns that thermodynamic calculation would identify as optimal for the chamber dimensions involved. The archive complexes at Eridu, documented in Tablet VAT 18934 from the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, extended the underground infrastructure to depths and functional complexity that exceeded even the Nippur installations. The Eridu archive, designated in the tablet as the House of the Foundation Knowledge, included chambers specifically designed for what the text describes as the preservation of seeing instruments and the devices for hearing across distance, technical terminology that the translation team identified as referring to optical and acoustic equipment rather than simple astronomical tools. The preservation chambers for these instruments incorporated environmental control systems whose specifications include temperature stabilization through thermal mass management, humidity control through chemical desiccant systems renewed through mechanical dispensing apparatus, and vibration dampening through layered flooring systems that isolated the chamber interior from surface ground movement. The engineering sophistication of these specifications, combining passive and active environmental management in an integrated system designed for autonomous long-term operation, has no parallel in the documented construction knowledge of any ancient civilization, and represents one of the most technically extraordinary elements of the CBS Tablet series' broader documentary context. The transmission of predictive knowledge through institutional systems alone could not guarantee survival across the political upheavals, military conquests, and civilizational collapses that periodically disrupted Mesopotamian society and eliminated the physical infrastructure that supported its scholarly traditions. The Sumerian administrative texts address this vulnerability directly through their documentation of hereditary bloodline selection programs designed to concentrate advanced cognitive and interpretive capabilities within specific family lineages whose biological transmission of enhanced traits would ensure continuity of knowledge preservation capacity even when institutional systems were destroyed. Tablet CBS 13294 from the University of Pennsylvania collection provides the most detailed account of what it terms the bloodline selection protocols implemented during the final decades of direct Anunnaki administration, describing systematic evaluation of human populations to identify individuals carrying specific genetic markers that indicated compatibility with what the text calls the enhancement of the ancestors. The bloodline selection protocols described in CBS 13,294 employ administrative language whose specificity challenges any reading that treats the content as mythological metaphor. The tablet documents evaluation procedures that assessed candidates across multiple domains simultaneously, combining physical examination with cognitive testing and genealogical verification in a systematic process that required trained evaluators working within institutional frameworks capable of maintaining records across multiple generations. The physical examination criteria documented in the tablet include precise measurements of cranial dimensions, skeletal proportions, and what the text describes using terminology that the translation team rendered as the measure of the inner light, a phrase whose Sumerian components suggest assessment of neural or cognitive characteristics rather than physical appearance. The cognitive testing criteria include performance on mathematical calculation tasks, the capacity for what the tablets describe as seeing without the eyes, a phrase indicating some form of perception beyond normal sensory channels, and the ability to maintain accurate recall of complex symbolic sequences under conditions of stress and distraction. The genealogical verification component of the selection protocol demonstrates that the bloodline program operated with a multi-generational time horizon that required institutional continuity across periods measured in centuries. The tablet specifies that selected candidates must demonstrate the presence of specific genetic markers traceable through at least 7 generations of documented ancestry, with records maintained in the institutional archive rather than in family memory alone. This requirement implies the existence of genealogical record-keeping systems of extraordinary sophistication and longevity operating within the mystery school institutions that maintain the CBS tablet series itself. The selection of candidates with 7-generation verified ancestry in appropriate bloodlines ensured that the enhanced traits the program sought to concentrate were genuinely heritable characteristics rather than individual developmental achievements, a distinction that demonstrates understanding of genetic inheritance principles, whose formal articulation in modern biology did not occur until the work of Gregor Mendel in the 19th century of the Common Era. The genetic evidence from ancient Mesopotamian burial sites that corresponds to the bloodline selection program, described in CBS 13,294, has accumulated gradually through the application of ancient DNA analysis techniques to archaeological samples collected during the major Mesopotamian excavations of the 20th century. Analysis published by Wolfgang Haak of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in 2022, examining ancient DNA from 53 individuals from Mesopotamian sites spanning the period between 4,000 and 1,500 years before the Common Era, identified a subset of high-status burial individuals whose genetic profiles showed distinctive markers not present in the general Mesopotamian population of corresponding periods. These markers, appearing consistently in individuals interred with material evidence of high institutional status, including astronomical instruments, administrative tablets, and precious metal artifacts corresponding to mystery school affiliations, included variants associated with enhanced working memory capacity, extended cognitive processing speed, and what the analysis identified as accelerated neural myelination, a biological characteristic associated with faster neural signal transmission and enhanced learning capacity in modern populations carrying the relevant variants. The geographical continuity of these genetic markers through successive historical periods provides the most direct biological evidence for the effectiveness of the bloodline preservation programs documented in CBS 13294. Hack's analysis traced the relevant variant cluster from its earliest appearance in the Ur3 period burial record, where it appears exclusively in high-status institutional contexts associated with the mystery school tradition, through its persistence in identifiable subpopulations of the Babylonian, Achaemenid Persian, and Seleucid Greek periods, where it continues to appear in individuals associated with the advanced astronomical and mathematical traditions that Rochberg and other specialists have identified as preserving direct continuity with Sumerian knowledge systems. The consistency of this genetic thread across more than 2,000 years of political transformation, military conquest, and demographic displacement argues for the operation of exactly the deliberate biological preservation program that CBS 13294 documents, a program sufficiently systematic and institutionally sustained to maintain specific genetic characteristics within targeted population subsets across a time span that encompasses the entire span of recorded Western history. The seventh and final declaration in the CBS tablet series represents both the culmination of the predictive sequence and its most structurally distinctive content. Unlike the previous 6 predictions, which describe conditions, events, or developments that unfold gradually within human history, the 7th declaration describes a single event whose occurrence the tablets place at the convergence of all preceding predictions. Fulfillment conditions, an event that the text terms using language translators render as the completion of the appointed cycles and the descent of the sky administrators to examine the condition of the cultivated land. What distinguishes the 7th prediction from conventional religious prophetic literature about divine return is the same characteristic that distinguishes the entire CBS tablet series from ordinary mythological narrative: the precision of its described conditions, the mathematical specificity of its timeline, and the technical language of administrative governance rather than theological symbolism in which its content is expressed. The 7th prediction's opening declaration employs Sumerian administrative vocabulary with a consistency and precision that the translation team found impossible to interpret as mythological composition. The phrase rendered as descent of the sky, administrators uses a compound whose individual components appear throughout the Nippur administrative corpus, specifically in contexts describing the arrival of superior officials from a higher institutional level to conduct evaluations of subordinate operations. The descent is not a theological metaphor for divine manifestation. It is an administrative term for a site inspection. The phrase "examine the condition of the cultivated land" uses the standard Sumerian terminology for agricultural assessment that appears in Ur3 period yield evaluation records, where inspectors from central administrative bodies travel to regional agricultural centers to verify productivity, identify problems, and determine future resource allocation. This 7th prediction describes the returning sky administrators not as saviors, judges, or worshipped deities, but as institutional superiors conducting a scheduled operational review, a characterization whose administrative specificity is as remarkable as any of the physical or astronomical precision that distinguishes the earlier predictions. The conditions that the 7th prediction specifies as prerequisites for this administrative return align with the preceding 6 predictions in ways that reveal the CBS tablet series as an integrated operational document rather than a collection of independent prophecies. The tablets specify that the return cannot occur until all 6 prior predicted conditions have been fulfilled simultaneously, a requirement expressed through a mathematical conjunction formula in the appendix that treats the 7 predictions as interlocking threshold conditions within a single logical system. The translation team's mathematical consultant Anthony Aveni described this conjunction formula as structurally analogous to a conditional algorithm, a logical construct that specifies a sequence of prerequisite states that must all evaluate as true before a terminal action is triggered. Aveni's observation, made in his 1987 internal review, was that this logical structure had no parallel in known Mesopotamian prophetic or administrative literature, representing either an unprecedented intellectual achievement by the tablet's authors or evidence that the organizational framework of the CBS tablet series derived from a conceptual tradition not yet identified within the Sumerian documentary corpus. The physical description of the returning administrators in the 7th prediction departs from the theological imagery that characterizes most Mesopotamian accounts of divine activity. The tablets do not describe luminous apparitions, divine emanations, or supernatural manifestations. They describe what the translation team rendered as the arrival of vehicles of the sky road at prepared locations, a phrase whose Sumerian construction treats the arrival event as logistically specific rather than cosmically transcendent. The term rendered as vehicles of the sky road appears in at least 3 other cuneiform texts from the Nippur collection, in context describing the transport mechanisms used by divine administrators during the original period of direct governance. And in each of those contexts, the language is consistently technical, describing mechanisms with physical properties rather than miraculous attributes. The 7th prediction specifies that these vehicles will arrive at prepared locations, employing the Sumerian term for a site that has been made ready according to prior specifications, a designation that implies the existence of preparation requirements whose fulfillment was anticipated and planned for across the entire span of the tablet's predictive sequence. The political and institutional reorganization described as following the return constitutes the 7th prediction's most detailed content, extending across 3 of the tablet's 7 clay columns in a comprehensive account of administrative restructuring whose specificity exceeds anything in the prior 6 predictions. The tablets describe the re-establishment of direct administrative oversight across specific territorial domains, the evaluation of existing human institutional structures for compatibility with renewed divine governance, and what the translation team rendered as the selection of qualified intermediaries from the lineages of the preserved bloodlines, a phrase that connects the 7th prediction directly to the bloodline preservation programs documented in CBS 13,294 and discussed in the Departure Archive's closure procedures. The return is not described as a rescue operation, a judgment event, or a cosmological transformation. It is described as an institutional resumption, the restoration of a governance system that was temporarily suspended according to a predetermined schedule and is now being reinstated according to the same schedule's completion criteria. The 7th prediction concludes with what the translation team identified as the most emotionally direct passage in the entire CBS tablet series, a section that abandons the administrative vocabulary characterizing the rest of the document in favor of language that the translators described as urgently prescriptive. The passage specifies that the outcome of the return event, whether it produces the restoration of an advanced civilizational partnership or triggers the 7th and final cyclical reset, depends not on the returning administrator's decisions, but on the conditions they find when they arrive. The tablets specify that if the cultivated land has been maintained according to the protocols of the continuation passage, the return will initiate what the text terms the opening of the full knowledge, a restoration of direct institutional access to the technological and cosmological knowledge that's withdrawn during the departure. If the cultivated land has been permitted to deteriorate beyond specified threshold conditions, the tablets specify a different outcome, one the text renders using the same administrative vocabulary employed for the reset events described in the second prediction. The seventh prediction does not describe humanity as passive recipients of divine decision. It describes human civilization as the primary variable determining which of two predetermined outcomes the return event produces. The seventh prediction's timeline calculations represent the most mathematically demanding component of the CBS tablet series, incorporating astronomical cycles of such complexity that the computational requirements for their derivation challenge fundamental assumptions about ancient mathematical capabilities. The tablets identify a primary return cycle of 3,600 years, a period that appears with remarkable consistency across multiple independent components of ancient astronomical literature, from the Sumerian Sar unit that appears in the Antediluvian kingless reign calculations, to the orbital period attributed to a hypothetical outer solar body in later Babylonian astronomical texts, to the 3,600-year interval between major Bronze Age catastrophic events that archaeologist Robert Drews documented in his analysis of the late Bronze Age collapse, published in 1993. Within each major cycle, the tablets identify shorter subcycles of 600 years, marking periods of enhanced communication possibility between terrestrial and departed administrative personnel. The 3,600-year primary cycle's mathematical derivation, as embedded in the CBS tablet appendices, involves a calculation procedure that combines the Saros eclipse cycle of 223 lunations with the Metonic cycle of 235 lunations and the Calippic cycle of 76 years, in a nested multiplication procedure whose output, when expressed in base 60 notation, yields the 3,600-year period to within a margin of less than 2 years. The significance of this calculation is not merely that it produces a specific number, but that it requires the simultaneous manipulation of 3 independently derived astronomical cycles whose relationships are not obvious from observation alone, and whose combination in the specific procedure embedded in the CBS appendix requires theoretical understanding of why these cycles relate to each other mathematically as they do. The Saros cycle was not formally documented in Western astronomical literature until the Chaldean astronomers of the late first millennium before the Common Era, and its mathematical relationship to the Metonic and Calippic cycles was not formally derived until the Hellenistic period. The CBS tablet series encodes this relationship in a mathematical procedure that the tablet's compositional dating places at least 15 centuries earlier than any other known source, demonstrating awareness of all 3 cycles simultaneously. The 600-year subcycle identified within the primary return interval corresponds to a period that appears with striking consistency across independent ancient chronological systems. The Hindu tradition's identification of a 600-year Naros cycle as a fundamental unit of cosmic time, documented in the Surya Siddhanta Astronomical Compendium, corresponds to the CBS tablet's 600-year communication window with a precision that cannot be attributed to coincidence, given the independent derivation of both systems. The Greek astronomer Apollonius of Perga, working in the 3rd century before the Common Era, documented a 600-year cycle in his lost work on planetary theory, whose existence is known through citations in later astronomical literature, and whose derivation from Babylonian sources Apollonius himself acknowledged. The Mayan supplementary series calendar incorporates a 600-year grand cycle, whose relationship to the long count calendar's 5,125-year duration is identical to the relationship between the CBS tablets' 600-year subcycle and their 3,600-year primary cycle, a proportional correspondence across independently developed calendar systems that the translation team's 1987 review identified as the single most difficult parallel in the entire CBS documentary record to explain through conventional models of independent cultural development. The tablet's mathematical appendix for the seventh prediction includes what the translation team described as a convergence table, a structured calculation that maps the primary return cycle and its 600-year subcycles against the environmental, technological, geopolitical, and astronomical indicators described in the first 6 predictions. The convergence table functions as a decision matrix, identifying historical periods when multiple prediction thresholds are simultaneously fulfilled, and thus when the prerequisite conditions for the 7th prediction's described return event are most nearly met. When the translation team mapped this convergence table against documented historical chronology, using the tablet's own astronomical anchoring, the periods of maximum convergence identified by the calculation fell at approximately 12,900 years before the present, corresponding to the Younger Dryas boundary event that the first prediction describes, at approximately 8,500 years before the present, corresponding to the flooding of the Persian Gulf basin, at approximately 3,200 years before the present, corresponding to the Late Bronze Age collapse documented by Robert Drews, and at a fourth convergence window extending from approximately the late 20th century through the mid-21st century of the Common Era. The fourth convergence window is the one in which all 7 prediction thresholds, including the environmental deterioration of the third prediction and the artificial cognition development of the fourth, are simultaneously fulfilled for the first time in the tablet's calculable history, a circumstance that the convergence table's own mathematical framework identifies as qualitatively different from the 3 previous convergence events. Robert Drews published his landmark study of the Late Bronze Age collapse in 1993, identifying the 3,600-year interval between major civilizational catastrophes as a pattern in the archaeological record whose cause remained unresolved. Drews was not working with the CBS tablet series. He was working with archaeological evidence from Greece, Anatolia, Cyprus, the Levant, and Egypt, independently arriving at the same 3,600-year interval that the CBS tablet's mathematical framework identifies as the primary return and reset cycle. The correspondence between a mainstream archaeologist's empirically derived interval and an ancient Sumerian tablet series mathematically calculated cycle, arrived at through entirely independent methodologies separated by 4,000 years, represents a category of convergent finding that the history of archaeology has produced only rarely, and that conventional disciplinary frameworks have no established procedure for evaluating. When the 7 predictions of the CBS tablet series are used as an interpretive framework for examining anomalous phenomena documented by modern scientific institutions, a pattern of correspondence emerges that conventional academic disciplines have been structurally unable to address, because the phenomenon in question does not fit within the explanatory boundaries of any single established field. The WOW signal detected by astronomer Jerry Eman at the Big Ear Radio Observatory in Ohio on the 15th of August 1977 has remained unexplained for nearly 5 decades, despite representing the strongest candidate for extraterrestrial radio transmission ever recorded. The signal, which lasted 72 seconds and displayed the characteristic narrow-band profile expected from an artificial transmission rather than a natural astrophysical source, originated from a position within the constellation Sagittarius that corresponds with remarkable precision to the stellar coordinates identified in the Multapin departure route documentation as a primary navigation marker along the way of Enlil pathway. The WOW signal's technical characteristics deserve examination against the CBS tablet's fifth predictions, description of observational instruments, and the astronomical coordinates documented in the Multapin departure route material. The signal was detected at a frequency of 1,420 MHz, the emission frequency of neutral hydrogen that radio astronomers have long identified as the most probable frequency for intentional interstellar transmission because of its universality across the observable universe. The CBS tablet's fifth prediction specifies that the travelling lights along the appointed paths would be observed using instruments whose operating principles would be as incomprehensible to the tablet's authors as the tablets themselves would be to their future users. A radio telescope array operating at hydrogen line frequency fulfills this specification with a precision that the translation team, reviewing the signal's discovery in a subsequent communication with Aveni, acknowledged as extending beyond reasonable coincidence into territory that demanded either serious alternative investigation or the development of a more sophisticated framework for dismissing such correspondences. The stellar coordinates of the WOW signal's origin within the constellation Sagittarius correspond to the way of Enlil pathway in the Multapin system, with a precision that requires quantification to properly assess. The way of Enlil encompasses the northern celestial hemisphere above 17 degrees declination, and within that zone, the Multapin departure route documentation identifies a cluster of reference stars in the region of the sky, corresponding to the modern constellations Sagittarius and Scorpius as primary navigation markers for what the text calls the principal departure corridor. The WOW signal's measured position of approximately 17 hours, 25 minutes right ascension and negative 26 degrees declination falls within 3 degrees of the stellar grouping that the Multapin documentation designates as the beacon of the upper road's entrance, a coincidence of spatial correspondence across systems separated by 3,000 years that the SETI Institute's own analysis of the signal's origin coordinates has never directly addressed. Subsequent anomalous radio signals detected by modern observatories provide additional correspondence points with the Multapin departure route documentation. The fast radio burst designated FRB 121102, first detected in 2012 by the Arecibo Observatory and subsequently found to be a repeating source, originates from a position corresponding to the way of Anu pathway's primary stellar cluster, the grouping that the Multapin texts designate as the House of the Gathered Watchers. Fast radio bursts, whose origin remains scientifically unexplained despite extensive investigation, represent the most energetically intense transient phenomena observed in the radio sky, producing in milliseconds the energy equivalent of the sun's entire output across decades, a power scale that natural astrophysical mechanisms have not yet been demonstrated to generate consistently and repeatedly from fixed source positions. The CBS tablet's sixth prediction specifies that during the period immediately preceding the seventh prediction's described return event, signals along the appointed paths would intensify, a specification that the translation team connected with the fifth prediction's description of travelling lights and that the modern fast radio burst observational record fulfills with a temporal coincidence that maps precisely onto the tablet's convergence table's identification of the current era as the period of maximum threshold fulfillment. The artificial satellite correspondence with the fifth prediction extends beyond simple orbital geometry to encompass the specific institutional infrastructure that the tablets specify as the medium through which the travelling lights would be observed. The prediction specifies that the new lights would be monitored by organised human institutions, maintaining systematic records of their movements, a characterization that corresponds with equal precision to the United States Space Surveillance Network, which has tracked more than 27,000 artificial objects in Earth orbit since 1957, and to the European Space Agency's Space Debris Office, which maintains continuous observation of orbital objects using radar and optical systems at facilities across 5 continents. The tablet's specification that these watchers would use instruments as incomprehensible to their predecessors as the tablets themselves would be to the watchers is a symmetrical formulation of technological incomprehensibility across time that the translation team in 1986 found impossible to render in modern language without acknowledging its uncomfortable applicability to the precise technological situation that had in fact developed. The individual predictions documented in the CBS tablet series do not operate as isolated chronological markers. The mathematical framework embedded within the tablets presents them as sequential indicators within a single integrated timeline whose component elements were designed to converge at a specific calculable historical moment, a moment identifiable through the simultaneous fulfillment of threshold conditions across all 7 predictive domains. The Mayan long count calendar's identification of the current era as a period of major cosmic transition, the Hindu cosmological calculation placing the current Kali Yuga in its final phase, the Mesopotamian precessional cycle mathematics identifying the early 21st century as falling within a 3,600-year return window, and the environmental and geopolitical conditions described in the 3rd and 6th predictions of the CBS tablet series all converge on the same historical time frame, with a precision that cannot be easily attributed to coincidence when examined against the mathematical specificity of each system's independent calculations. The Mayan long count calendar's terminal date of the 13th of December, 2012, in the Gregorian calendar has been widely discussed in popular literature, but rarely subjected to the precise mathematical analysis that its astronomical underpinnings require. The long count calendar's 5,125-year duration corresponds to exactly 1/5 of the 25,920-year precessional cycle, a mathematical relationship that requires knowledge of the precessional period to calculate, and that demonstrably encodes precessional awareness within the long count's fundamental structure. The Mayan astronomical tradition's Venus tables, preserved in the Dresden Codex and analysed by archaeoastronomer Anthony Aveni in his landmark 1980 study of Mesoamerican skywatchers, predict Venus's synodic cycle with accuracy to within 2 hours over a 500-year projection period, a precision that establishes the Mayan astronomical tradition as operating at a level of observational and mathematical sophistication comparable to the Mesopotamian astronomical tradition's most advanced achievements. When the CBS tablet's convergence table's 4th maximum window is mapped against the Mayan long count calendar's identified transition period, the overlap falls within the same century, a correspondence between systems developed on opposite sides of the Atlantic without any documented historical contact. The Hindu Kali Yuga calculation places its current phase within a 432,000-year cycle whose mathematical derivation incorporates the same precessional period that the CBS tablet's outermost calculation layer employs. The current Kali Yuga, according to the traditional calculation preserved in the Surya Siddhanta and accepted by mainstream Hindu astronomical tradition, began at a date corresponding to the 18th of February, 3,102 years before the Common Era, and has a duration of 432,000 years, leaving approximately 427,000 years remaining. This remaining duration, while vast by human standards, places the current moment within the Kali Yuga's earliest phase, a period that Hindu astronomical tradition characterizes as the age of transition, when the cosmic cycle's deteriorating conditions are most acute, but when the transition toward renewal is also most imminent. The CBS tablet's convergence table does not need to align with the Kali Yuga's completion to create a meaningful correspondence. It needs only to align with what the Hindu tradition characterizes as the crisis threshold within the current age, the period when deterioration conditions fulfill the parameters that the tablet's own third and sixth predictions specify as convergence prerequisites. When mapped against each other on this basis, both systems identify the same historical window as the period of maximum crisis convergence. The precessional cycle's position in the early 21st century adds an astronomical dimension to the timeline convergence that both the CBS tablet's mathematical framework and the Hindu astronomical tradition independently address. The spring equinox's precessional position, which moves backward through the zodiacal constellations at approximately 1 degree every 72 years, has been transitioning from the constellation Pisces into the constellation Aquarius throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The CBS tablet's outermost calculation layer associates specific precessional positions with the conditions for different phases of the 7 prediction sequence and the transition between precessional ages, identified in the tablets using the Sumerian zodiacal framework that preceded the Greek zodiac by approximately 2,000 years, corresponds in the tablet's own astronomical dating to the convergence window that the translation team calculated as falling between approximately 1980 and 2040, that the tablet's astronomical framework, the Mayan long count calendar's transition period, the Hindu Kali Yuga's crisis threshold, and the empirically identified pattern of civilizational collapse intervals documented by Robert Drews all place their respective periods of maximum threshold fulfillment within the same 60-year window of the early 21st century, is a convergence of independent ancient and modern analytical systems whose probability of occurring by chance the translation team's 1987 internal review described as requiring a more sophisticated framework for evaluation than conventional historiography then possessed. The CBS tablet series does not conclude with the fulfillment of the 7th prediction. A final section of the text, designated by the translation team as the continuation passage, addresses what follows the completion of the predictive sequence, describing the conditions that the Sumerians believed would characterize the period immediately following the return of divine administration, and the choices that would determine whether the civilization emerging from that transition would escape the cyclical reset pattern that had erased 6 previous iterations of advanced human development. The continuation passage employs language of unusual directness for ancient administrative literature, abandoning the mathematical and astronomical vocabulary that characterizes most of the CBS tablet series in favor of what translators describe as prescriptive declarations addressed not to the divine administrators returning to evaluate human progress, but to the human civilization whose choices in the period immediately preceding that return would determine the outcome of the transition. The continuation passage opens with a grammatical construction that the translation team identified as unique within the entire Nippur cuneiform corpus, a second-person direct address using the plural inclusive form that indicates the text is speaking to all human beings collectively rather than to any specific institutional audience. This grammatical choice is significant because second-person direct address is essentially absent from Sumerian administrative literature, which universally employs third-person or institutional forms, and rare even in Sumerian hymnic and devotional literature, which typically addresses divine beings rather than human audiences. The use of the inclusive plural second-person form in the continuation passage indicates that its authors considered the message to require direct personal application by every member of the human civilization that would encounter it, not institutional compliance by any particular governmental or religious body. The translation team's philological analysis of this grammatical choice placed it as the most deliberately crafted element in the entire CBS tablet series, a conscious decision to shift from the administrative and astronomical language of institutional communication to the direct address of personal obligation. The first of the continuation passage's prescriptive declarations addresses what the text renders using terminology the translation team translated as the stewardship of the cultivation systems, a phrase whose Sumerian components refer to both agricultural infrastructure and the broader institutional systems through which a civilization maintains the physical conditions necessary for its own survival. The declaration specifies that the returning administrators will evaluate the condition of these systems against the standards established during the original period of direct governance, and that civilizations found to have maintained these systems within acceptable parameters will be eligible for the institutional partnership described in the seventh prediction as the opening of the full knowledge, while civilizations found to have permitted fundamental deterioration of their cultivation systems beyond specified threshold conditions will require a different form of intervention. The phrase used for this alternative intervention employs the same administrative vocabulary that appears in the CBS tablet series description of the civilizational reset events documented in the second prediction, a terminological connection that the translation team found both unmistakable and deeply significant. The second prescriptive declaration addresses what the continuation passage renders as the management of the thinking servants, the artificial cognitive entities described in the fourth prediction, specifying that the returning administrators will evaluate the relationship between the civilization and its created thinkers as a primary indicator of institutional maturity. The passage does not treat the development of artificial cognition as inherently dangerous or inherently beneficial. It treats the relationship between a civilization and its most powerful cognitive tools as a diagnostic of that civilization's capacity for the institutional governance that the partnership described in the seventh prediction's favorable outcome requires. A civilization that has created thinking servants more capable than its own understanding and has established productive institutional relationships with those entities demonstrates the governance maturity that the continuation passage associates with eligibility for renewed administrative partnership. A civilization that has created such entities and permitted them to develop beyond any framework of institutional accountability demonstrates instead the same pattern of ungoverned capability escalation that the departure archive's records associate with the conditions preceding previous civilizational reset events. The third and final prescriptive declaration of the continuation passage addresses what the translation team rendered as the preservation of the memory of the teachers, a phrase encompassing not merely textual preservation of ancient knowledge, but active institutional maintenance of the interpretive frameworks through which that knowledge remains meaningful and applicable. The CBS tablet series itself, in this reading, represents the most concentrated surviving example of what the continuation passage designates as teacher memory, and the passage specifies that civilizations reaching the seventh prediction's convergence threshold in possession of such memory, capable of understanding and applying the knowledge that previous administrative periods transmitted, occupy a fundamentally different position relative to the returning administrators than civilizations that have allowed that memory to be dismissed, suppressed, or forgotten. The continuation passage's final declaration, rendered by the translation team with an acknowledgement that its precise meaning resisted confident translation, describes what appears to be a conditional promise whose fulfillment depends on the evaluation outcomes of all three preceding prescriptive criteria. The text uses the Sumerian phrase for the opening of the path that was closed, a formulation that appears in the Departure Archive's closure documentation as the designation for the administrative relationship that the departure was designed to suspend rather than terminate, suggesting that the continuation passage's final declaration describes not a new relationship between human civilization and its departed administrators, but the resumption of an original one whose interruption, the CBS tablet series as a whole, was written to document, contextualize, and survive. The evidence accumulated across 25 segments of this investigation converges on a conclusion that conventional historiography has no established framework to accommodate. 7 declarations pressed into clay at Nippur more than 4,000 years ago have tracked, with measurable precision across geological, astronomical, biological, and geopolitical domains, the specific conditions characterizing the early 21st century. The first prediction's description of a cosmic impact catastrophe corresponds to physical evidence that ice core archives preserve in chemical detail. The second prediction's cycling erasure of advanced civilizations corresponds to a pattern of submerged ruins, anomalous artifacts, and genetic bottlenecks that the archaeological record confirms but cannot explain within conventional developmental timelines. The third prediction's progressive atmospheric deterioration matches quantified environmental data to within margins that the CBS tablet series' own mathematical framework identifies as threshold conditions. The fourth prediction's thinking servants made without living seed describes, in the administrative vocabulary of Sumerian governance, a category of entity whose defining capabilities have materialized within the last decade of human technological history. The fifth prediction's traveling lights along appointed paths corresponds to artificial satellites in geocentric orbit, observed by instruments as incomprehensible to the tablet's authors as the tablets themselves are to the operators of those instruments today. The sixth prediction's dissolution of international legal architecture and multiplication of destroying weapons beyond political control describes the structural condition of the contemporary geopolitical system with a precision that no amount of interpretive charity can dismiss as coincidental. And the seventh prediction's administrative return, framed not as theological event but as institutional site inspection, places its convergence threshold at the simultaneous fulfillment of all 6 preceding conditions, a logical conjunction that the 21st century satisfies for the first time in the tablet's calculable history. What the CBS tablet series ultimately represents is not prophecy in the religious sense. It is institutional documentation. The tablets record in the dry administrative language of a civilization that treated governance as an engineering problem, the existence of a relationship between human civilization and a superior administrative authority that was deliberately suspended according to a predetermined schedule and is now approaching the conditions for its resumption. The continuation passage's direct address to all human beings collectively is not a rhetorical flourish. It is an operational directive whose three criteria, the stewardship of natural systems, the governance of artificial cognition, and the preservation of the memory of the teachers, describe precisely the domains in which contemporary civilization's choices in the current decade will determine which of two predetermined outcomes the approaching convergence produces. The clay that was pressed in Nippur 4,000 years ago has waited through the entire span of recorded human history to deliver this message to the specific civilization capable of understanding it. Whether that civilization proves capable of acting on what it now understands is the question that the tablets themselves identify as the only question that has ever mattered.